Eyewitnessed, a biographical novel by Ursula Janssen, read by Clara Noor Deghati. Dedicated to all humans who seek freedom of expression. Drink wine, this is life eternal. This is all that youth will give you. It is the season for wine, roses, and drunken friends. Be happy for this moment. This moment is your life. Omar Khayyam. Preface. The wind is howling in the almond trees and the vineyard, tearing at the young olive tree branches. My husband Manoocher and I are sitting at the fireplace of our rural home in the beautiful region of Puglia in southern Italy, sipping on glasses of our homemade wine. Outside the weather is cool and stormy, as it frequently is during the winter months on this strip of land between two seas. Manoocher is telling me more details about his adventurous life around the globe from the time before we met 18 years ago, some of which I have heard before, but also some that are still new to me. I have decided to write them down. So many of his stories seem incredible, more fantastic than any invented story could be. Yet they are true. Looking for an inspiration for my next novel, I suddenly realized that I have a unique source of not only stories, but also of history right under my nose. My dear and sometimes all too modest husband has already protested that this book talks too much of him, mentions his name too often, but I insist. This time the story told will be his story, and this book will be about him and his life's adventures. Manoocher's story will be told in an unusual form, not as a biography but as a novel. Of course, a novel cannot be a historic document. Who would be able to remember who said what exactly all those years ago? Therefore, I am asking you, dear reader, to take this book for what it is, a fictional adaptation of an authentic life genuinely lived. All occasions described in this book are real. Most dialogues probably are not. On some occasions, I have changed some characters' names and other details in order to protect them or not to violate anybody's deserved privacy. Martina Franca, March 22nd, 2020. 1. Born to be wild. We are born of love. Love is our mother. Rumi. Urmia, northwestern Iran, 1954. Nezakat was standing in the kitchen of her home in Urmia, cutting fruit to prepare breakfast for her family. Her hands were restless, as usual, and she had been up since dawn, despite being 7 months pregnant. She was constantly working on something, cooking, pickling, sewing, knitting, gardening, preparing herbal medicines, cleaning. Not that anybody had forced her to do so, no. Nezakat just was a restless person, uneasy when sitting still. And she truly enjoyed the cooking, preparing meals for her beloved family, humming a happy little melody. Her husband was getting ready for work, her eldest daughter had gone to fetch fresh bread, and the two little ones were happily playing on the colorful rug that had been laid out on the floor of the adjacent courtyard. It was going to be another hot summer day. She had tied her long dark hair into a practical bun to keep her neck cool and her hair out of the way. She still felt the fatigue of the previous day's long bus trip over a bumpy dirt road from Tabriz, where she had spent some days visiting her relatives. The house was a beautiful building of the kind that had been built here for centuries. It had a courtyard with a water well, the house's only source of water, and a small but meticulously kept herb and vegetable garden flanked by the rooms the family lived in. Or, more accurately, the room, because most of the family's life took place inside one room, where the family ate together, seated on the floor around a carefully spread tablecloth, and where everybody slept at night as well. The mattresses made from sheep's wool, the covers and pillows rolled up every morning and stored away in a corner to make room for the activities of the day. There were other rooms, of course. The kitchen was frequently used as well, and so was the father's study, in which he read and received friends with whom he discussed philosophy or politics or recited poetry. And then there was the closed room. Not that it was forbidden to enter it simply wasn't used except for special occasions. It had a divan and tables and chairs that were strictly reserved for guests, carefully covered with tissues when not in use. The family preferred the leisurely comfort of a carpeted floor. That way it was much easier to heat only the used space in the long icy winter months when temperatures would drop to -15 degrees Celsius. But this one room was always nice and warm and cozy. Nezakat suddenly stiffed and dropped the knife. Abruptly and without warning, a sharp pain tore through her bowels. She knew this kind of pain, but this wasn't right. It was far too early, and there hadn't been any previous signs of labor. The contractions repeated ceaselessly with a pain more overwhelming than anything she had ever felt before. With both hands she held onto the table to keep upright and emitted a sharp scream. Her husband Yadollah, a serious-looking man with round glasses and a fashionable little mustache, came running instantly, but to her it seemed an eternity. He was a man in his 50s, having married late, and his wife wasn't young either. He gently helped her down on the floor into a crouching position and called for his sister-in-law, Nezakat's sister, who had joined her on the trip from Tabriz to spend some time at her in-laws' home in Urmia. But there was no need to shout, as she was already in the doorway, having heard her sister's scream as well. The two small children watched in petrified silence, their eyes big from fear for their mother. "Let me take care of her. You go and get the midwife. Hurry!" she told Yadollah. Without another word, Yadollah jumped to his feet and ran out of the house, calling for a hackney cab, hurrying down the street. Luckily he found one quickly. There were always coachmen looking for customers around. Yadollah jumped into the coach box and rattled off the midwife's address. "And hurry up, for God's sake!" Meanwhile, in the house, the woman had realized what was going on. A precipitate birth, and an extremely fast one at that. Nezakat's sister got a bucket full of ash from the fireplace. Ash was practically aseptic, and there was no time to heat water. She placed the ash under her crouching sister, who was shivering from the sudden and violent arrival of full-scale contractions and letting out another shriek. A gush of blood splashed onto the bed of ash, and there it was, a baby so tiny it almost looked unreal. Its umbilical cord was wrapped around its neck, and its small face had turned completely blue. With swift movements, the sister removed the umbilical cord and started to massage the little chest. Thank God the baby started breathing. But it didn't cry. No sound passed through his lips. "What's happening? Is it dead? Tell me!" demanded Nezakat, who was slowly recovering her breath. "No, it's alive. It's a boy." And Nezakat's sister placed the baby, tiny and grey from the ash like a mouse, into its mother's arms, getting up to fetch a blanket to wrap the child in, and finally heat some water to wash mother and child and to calm down the scared siblings. By the time Yadollah returned home with the midwife, his youngest son had been born. They called him Manoocher, which means heaven's face in Old Persian, but he still had not emitted a single sound. The doctor was called, a learned man in his 50s with a great reputation and round eyeglasses on an even rounder face. He glanced at the baby for only a moment before proclaiming to the parents with utter conviction, "I fear that it is too small. It will surely die. Don't waste your efforts on it. There's no need of feeding. Just leave it." "But I cannot leave my child to die," Nezakat protested. "It is better for you, madam, believe me. Do not start a bond with a child that is doomed. It would only worsen your grief. There is no hope." And with these encouraging words, the man excused himself and had himself led to the front door. Having seen the doctor off, Yadallah returned to the living room with a frown on his face. His wife was still standing there, cradling the baby. "There is no way I'm leaving my child to die," she repeated, and started nursing him. "I know." And Manoocher did survive. After 1 week, his parents felt confident enough to register his birth with the local authorities. He grew, though he remained small and sickly, but he rarely ever cried. 2. Ice and Snow and Love. Raise your words, not voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. Rumi. Tabriz, 1955–64. When Manoocher was 1 year old, his family moved back to their hometown of Tabriz, where they set up their home in yet another beautiful small house in the old city, similar to the one they had lived in during their time in Urmia. The climate of Tabriz, a town situated 1,400 meters high in the Caucasus Mountains, is harsher than that of Urmia, with winter temperatures dropping to -25 degrees Celsius. In his first years of life, Manoocher stayed at home a lot with his mother, his aunts, and his two sisters, suffering from colds and fevers frequently. This is how he learned knitting at an early age. Looking young for his age, he used to visit the hammam together with his mother on the women's days until the age of 7, looking curiously at the elaborate beauty rituals the women performed, listening to their jokes and occasional juicy gossip, and admiring all the unabashed nudity. That winter, the woman who ran the hammam took his mother aside and told her, "Next time, don't bring your boy with you. He's starting to be too curious." From that day on, he only visited the baths with his father and elder brother. Once he started school, Manoocher found out that not only did some of the teachers have a tendency towards violence, but also his classmates were commonly beaten at home by their parents, something he could not even have imagined. There was no violence in their home, only love and kindness and the respect that comes with kindness. There was also a little desire to give in to societal pressures. His sisters Parivash and Parichair were the only girls on their street to leave the house unveiled without giving it a second thought. That year's winter was one of the coldest in many years. The snow was piling up so high that people had to dig corridors in the snow to move from house to house. Gasoline for heating the houses was getting scarce because the trucks needed it to be able to climb the icy roads. Tabriz was basically snowed in. The shop owners in the old bazaar, under its beautifully arched brick vaults that Marco Polo had written about, kept their little shops heated with small fires over which they also warmed their hands. They were bundled up in thick layers of clothes and shawls, just like their customers. Beams of sunlight from the clear blue sky shone through windows in the ceiling, crossed the spice-scented air, and cast patches of light onto the displayed goods without adding any warmth. The old people said it was the coldest winter anyone could remember. One day, little Manoocher fainted from exposure. He and his older brother Reza had been waiting in a long line of people in an attempt to buy some gasoline from a store on the main road. It was the same winter in which the water meter froze. The parents and older siblings weren't home, and Manoocher and Reza had a glorious idea. "Let's heat the tubes and the meter. We can unfreeze the water." "You mean make a fire?" "Why not? Ice won't burn, only melt. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? And we'll have running water again." "I'll go gather some small pieces of wood. And I'll get a little gasoline as a starter." So the two brothers piled up some twigs and small branches under the frozen water meter, poured some gasoline over it, and ignited the whole thing. Of course, it hadn't been a good idea from the start. Of course, the rubber seal started burning, and the whole thing just burst. Water gushed into the courtyard in a continuous spurt, quickly filling it. It began to enter the house and instantly started to freeze over. What a disaster! The first neighbors started to appear, drawn by the unusual noise. "What on earth has happened here?" a neighbor asked. The boys hesitated. "The water pipe broke," one of them finally said. "I can see that. Where are your parents?" "They aren't home." "Oh dear. Now you try to save everything that's inside the house on the floor. I'll go get the water company people here." And off he went to their office. There weren't any telephones in the neighborhood yet. The water company staff that came to stop the water had to dig down to the underground tube. There were no emergency valves. The ground was frozen and hard as stone, and so it took the men 2 hours to find the tube and close it. By the time the water had finally stopped, not only the courtyard, but also the entire floor inside the house was covered with frozen water. When Manoocher and Reza's parents returned home, they found a mess, but they never even scolded their children. The boys had obviously meant well, and they had obviously already learned that the idea had been seriously stupid. They all spent the night at a neighbor's house and started to tidy up the next day. The winter passed, summer eventually arrived, and with it the long school holidays. Manoocher had been a resourceful businessman since he was small, selling pieces of chocolate or corn cobs in his free time to make some pocket money. This year he had a new line of business in mind: movie film strips. How come? Well, Manoocher had discovered cinema. There were several small theaters in Tabriz, all of them cutting their own film rolls of Indian, Italian, and American movies to match the needs of their screens and schedules. The leftover film scraps were simply thrown away, and that was where Manoocher came in. He cut single frames and arranged them into small stories or scenic evocations on a sheet of paper. "Do you have that Indian actress from last week? I really liked her," a boy asked. "Sure," Manoocher replied, rummaging through his film sheets. "Here, I have 2 of them left." "Any cowboy movies this week?" another boy asked. "I have this one here, with John Wayne, look." He pulled out the sheet and showed him. "How much?" "50 Shahi. And take a look at these scenes from Tarzan. Here you can see him swinging from tree to tree, and this one shows Jane." "What else do you have?" "Well, here's Clint Eastwood, look, then Abidjan, King Kong versus Godzilla, The Heart is a Temple, that Indian movie with the doctor, remember? I have Cleopatra, and here I got the latest Italian movie with Franco and Ciccio." "What's in that box there?" "Those are single film frames. It's a lottery. Some are marked as a win, some as blank. You pay 10 Shahi and get 1 lottery ticket, and if you win, you can choose a movie sheet." "Give me one! Me too!" That was Manoocher's first professional experience in the film business. When Manoocher's sister Paricher was 15, their cousin's family from Tehran urged the family to engage the young girl to their son, relentlessly appealing to family loyalty until Yadollah and Nezakat eventually agreed to receive the family in an official visit. The oldest girl, Parivash, was already married at the time. "I'm not going to get engaged. I hardly know him," Paricher cried. "They're coming all the way from Tehran," said Nezakat. "Let's at least see what they have to say first. Nothing is decided yet." "They've already decided, and nobody's even asked me." "Maybe he isn't that bad." "I'll never marry him." "Nobody's talking about marriage yet, Paricher, please." "I won't get engaged either. I simply refuse." The family from the capital arrived. The future fiancé and his siblings, mother and father, with lots of precious gifts and presents, all too obviously engagement gifts, sweets from Tehran's best confectioneries, several pieces of jewellery, an expensive tea set made from eggshell-thin, gilt-edged china, and a fancy engagement dress made from a fine light blue tissue with embroidery. It was all too much. First, the family served tea, fruit, and pastries. Later, they all sat down to an elaborate dinner, naturally in the usually unused parlour with the good armchairs that had been rearranged just for the guests. They talked about trivia, complacent niceties, and rehashed old family stories. Paricher barely said a single word all evening, tears glistening in her eyes. Manoocher was shocked to see his sister like that, his cousin's family apparently uncaring, and his own parents stuck between tradition, polite hospitality, family loyalty, and concern for their daughter. That very night, when everybody finally went to bed, he stealthily got up and snuck into the study where the presents from Tehran had been stored, careful not to make a sound. He held his breath and listened. When he was sure no one else was awake, he took a pair of scissors from the drawer of his father's desk and set to work. Meticulously and purposefully, ever so often pausing to listen for sounds of anyone stirring, he shredded the beautiful engagement dress to pieces. The next morning the cousin's family was shocked and aghast. Manoocher's parents weren't. Once again they didn't scold him. Although they must have suspected he was the culprit, maybe they were relieved to find an unexpected way out of this mess. Paricher made no show of hiding her relief when the engagement was cancelled for good and the cousin's family returned home. Resistance does work, Manoocher learned. 3. A rebel in the making. Question everything. Learn something. Answer nothing. Euripides. Judge a man by his questions rather than by his answers. Voltaire. Tehran, 1965–67. Manoocher was 10 years old when his father's job, he worked as a labor inspector, demanded that the family move to the capital, Tehran. Tabriz had an age-old history and had always been a center of culture and commerce, but honestly, by the 1960s, it had become a little backwaterish. Tehran, in contrast, was a bustling and vibrant modern capital with high-rising buildings, wide boulevards, cafes on every street corner, a vibrant young music scene, and, last but not least, women in miniskirts. It all seemed gorgeous to Manoocher, but maybe at the same time a little intimidating. Up to this day he had only spoken Azeri, his mother's tongue, the Turkic language of Azerbaijan. Now, suddenly, he was not only required to change schools, but also his language. He didn't speak a word of Farsi, unlike his older siblings who had already studied the language at school. Children from Azeri minority were forbidden to speak their mother tongue at school and were beaten if they did. Manoocher was scared. On the first day of the new school year, he timidly knocked on the door of what was supposed to be his new classroom, standing in a corridor of the big grey building of what would be his school in Tehran from now on. A female voice answered, and he opened the door to step in. The first thing he saw were 24 children his age staring at him. "Manoocher, what on earth are you doing here?" The woman speaking was his former teacher from his school in Tabriz, sitting right here at the teacher's desk in front of him and speaking in Azeri. His jaw dropped for a moment before he could reply. "I go to school here now. We moved to Tehran. But what are you doing here?" She smiled. "I moved here too. I have been transferred to the school." What an unbelievable coincidence. She was a kind woman. She took good care of him and made sure he learned Farsi quickly. The other teachers were not so kind. Beatings were a common way of punishing students, and overall there was a huge focus on discipline and punishment, which stirred and nurtured Manoocher's sense of resistance and his disrespect for violence and violent people. Students weren't supposed to have an opinion of their own. He made sure everybody knew he had one. They weren't supposed to ask questions. He asked even more, especially of his religion teacher. "I read about evolution the other day. It says that humans are related to apes." No, look, it is all written in the Quran. God created Adam, the first man, on the 6th day, after he created plants and animals and everything else. But if we descend from apes, that means that Adam was an ape, doesn't it? The teacher's face turned purple. The veins on his forehead bulged. "Out! Get out of my sight! Leave this classroom immediately!" In those days, Iranian school taught a special subject, the White Revolution. This was a series of reforms designed by the Shah to develop Iran, educate its citizens, emancipate its women, and abolish feudalism with the help of a major land reform. Not a bad thing at all, actually, but there were some problems, to put it mildly, with the way these changes were implemented. You might say, and rightly so, of course, there are implementation problems with every reform ever having taken place in history. But the difference is that Iranians weren't allowed to mention these problems, not even to raise any questions. Nevertheless, Manoocher asked some questions, which is why his White Revolution teacher called the CIAK, the Shah's secret service, to detain and interrogate him, a schoolboy, for the rest of the day. What a nurturing and supportive teacher. Apart from his minor rebellious acts, Manoocher's first years in Tehran passed smoothly. The astronauts of the 1969 moon landing drove through the city in a huge parade, hailed as heroes by its citizens. On some afternoons he helped a boy from the neighborhood, a slender boy named Mustafa, who came from a poor family, with his homework. He spent a lot of time with hippies passing through on their way from Europe to India, and learned English from them. The Shah's education reforms didn't go so far as to teach students an actually useful foreign language apart from the obligatory classic Quranic Arabic. 4. Why Manoocher and his siblings weren't born in Siberia. Traveling, it leaves you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller. Ibn Battuta. Bandar Abbas, 1968-1969. In 1968, Yadollah was temporarily transferred to Bandar Abbas in the south of Iran on the Persian Gulf. His new job as a work inspector for the Persian Gulf region was limited to 1 or 2 years, so the family decided not to move the entire household once more. This meant that in the end, only Manoocher accompanied his father to Bandar Abbas, while his elder sisters and brother stayed with their mother in Tehran. Although Bandar Abbas was a part of their own country, to them it was a place as exotic as they could imagine. The Persian Gulf coast is tropical, humid and very, very hot, immediately drenching any unfamiliar visitor in sweat and in search for a place to cool down. Literally thousands of years of sea trade with the places as far away as India, China, and the Swahili coast have left their traces in culture, cuisine, music, and the people themselves. Everything felt different, looked different, and even smelled different. On their very first evening there, after a light meal of salad, bread, and fruit, Manoocher stepped outside the small house that would be their home for the next year or so. It was a very modest place, one-storied, with 2 bedrooms, a tiny bath, and a very simply furnished kitchen. Nevertheless, this was considered luxurious compared to the surrounding palm-leaf-covered huts. The evening air was as hot as sticky outside as it was inside. The light sea breeze hardly brought any relief. Manoocher had not been drawn outside by the hope for refreshment, but by the noise he had heard, faintly at first, then getting slowly louder. A steady hum approaching the street he was standing on. He walked towards the drumming and singing in an unfamiliar melodies and rhythms, foreign and mesmerizing. They reminded him of what he thought to be African drums. He turned a corner that led to a small, dusty, and barren square, and there he saw the musicians, who surprised him. They looked like Africans too. Later he learned that Bandar Abbas had been a center of the slave trade for centuries, and that many former slaves, whose ancestors had been abducted from their African home countries, had stayed on the Persian Gulf coast and become Iranian citizens. But for that first moment Manoocher was simply fascinated by the exoticism of the scene unfolding before him. It was a ceremony of some kind, involving a group of musicians consisting of singing drummers and a man playing bagpipes. They were standing in a semicircle around the leader of the ceremony, a healer of some kind, probably, who was supporting and encouraging a man, a patient maybe, who was apparently in trance, shivering and shaking to the rhythm of the drums, his gaze wide-eyed and unfocused. A healing ceremony, probably, an exorcism from a czar, a demon causing those he possesses to fall ill. The whole scene was lit only by the full moon and a couple of fires, bathing the scene in a wavering light. The music went on and on ceaselessly. Manoocher could not tear his eyes away from the ceremony. Who knows how long he stood there, motionless, until his father gently touched his shoulder and led him back home. Bandar Abbas was different not only at night, but also in plain daylight, especially to someone coming from Tehran. The women's dresses were more colorful, although all of them were completely veiled. There were all kinds of different smells in the air, some pleasant, some less so, and all the boys seemed to spend their entire days outside on the beach or in the water. A lot of them already worked as fishermen to help their families make a living. The sea was so full of fish of all kinds that fishing was an easy task. Manoocher spent a lot of time with the fishing boys, learning from them how to catch fish without much effort. The boys' mothers, their faces covered and protected from both others' gazes and the scorching sun by colorful and glittering masks, sold the fish directly on the beach, sitting next to their wares that they had spread out directly on the sand. In the scorching heat, the silver fish bodies were covered in buzzing clouds of flies in no time, as the newcomer from the capital discovered not without disgust. He preferred to fish for dinner himself, only just before the fish was going to be prepared. His new friends made him taste a strange creature for the first time, shrimp. At home, in the north, nobody would have even touched a creature that looked so much like an insect, but here people seemed to have no trouble eating it, so why not? Sometimes a lobster got caught in the fishing net, too. Even the locals wouldn't think of eating an animal that looked like that. But they knew of a Frenchman living in town and one of the very few foreigners around. Rumor had it that he ate creepy things, so the fishing boys regularly bought him their accidentally caught lobsters as a gift, maybe for a small reward sometimes, but who could seriously ask money for a creature like that? The Frenchman didn't complain. When school started again after the long and hot summer, Manoocher bought himself his first bicycle because his school was several kilometers away from their home. Despite the summer being over and the landscape being as flat as a taftoon flatbread, he was drenched in sweat when he arrived to school in the mornings and back home in the afternoons. Life would have been wonderful here, free and full of adventures, if only it wasn't so damned hot and humid all the time. It happened that Yadollah had to go on a work trip to the trading port on the opposite side of the Strait of Hormuz, the sea passage that connects the Persian Gulf with the Indian Ocean. It was a small port town important for the trade it did with Iran, but it didn't have much infrastructure apart from its port. Manoocher had hardly heard of the place. It was called Dubai. His father decided that a couple of weeks of traveling were more beneficial for his son than staying alone at home and going to school, so he took him out of school and on his business trip to the Arabian Peninsula. They took a sailing boat, a dhow, the traditional Indian Ocean traders' ship for the kind that had been used in these waters for centuries, probably millennia, and which was the only means of transport across the Strait of Hormuz. It had just one sail and was astonishingly fast and stable in the water. The sea journey, nevertheless, took the entire day, and it was dusk before their ship finally approached the port of Dubai. There were a few lights in the harbour, but where was the town? The horizon was pitch dark, and there was no settlement to be seen. After docking in the port, they took a room at the only hotel in town, a newly constructed two-story block building with 8 bedrooms run by an Indian family. It had running water, but no electricity. The only light came from kerosene lamps, and that was considered a luxury. Which was why, Manoocher thought, the town had not been visible from the sea at night. Apparently, he was told, though, there was a lot of construction going on at the moment, and 2 more hotels were even being built, as the newly constructed airport was bringing more overnight visitors to Dubai. This was such a backwater place. Would it ever be able to develop? Probably not. Most houses still weren't much more than huts covered with palm leaves. Yadollah spent his days in business meetings and inspecting whatever he had to inspect. Sometimes Manoocher joined him, other times he was allowed to simply wander around by himself. What could possibly happen in such an out-of-the-way place? And there were enough Iranian businessmen around who spoke both Farsi and Arabic in case the boy got lost. In the evenings they enjoyed a simple meal together and went for a little after-dinner walk along the port once temperatures had finally started to drop. During one of these strolls, Manoocher's father, apparently in a storytelling mood, asked him, "I've never told you how I escaped the Gulag, have I?" "The Gulag? You mean those terrible Russian work camps in Siberia, Arjun?" "Exactly those. Listen, my son. It was a few years after the Russian Revolution, which happened 50 years ago. You know that after the Russian Empire collapsed, the Democratic Republic of Azerbaijan was founded. It was a real parliamentary democracy with equal rights for men and women. My cousin's family in Baku, you were never able to meet them, were looking forward to a bright future, and we, my brother and me, used to visit them frequently. But the Russians returned. The Bolsheviks occupied northern Azerbaijan, killing thousands of people. Then they introduced their rules and closed down the borders. It meant that even basic commodities got scarce for normal people: sugar, soap, shaving blades, medicine. Our cousins were still able to send us messages. Even Russians cannot close down a mountain range, telling us about the increasing lack of everything. So my brother Azadullah and I bought a large amount of goods, took a few sturdy mules, and crossed the border, moving up through the dry plains until we reached Baku, where we could stay with my cousins. We did that several times. It was good business, too, and nothing ever happened. We felt safe and became more confident. But one day, on one of our trips to Baku, we were near Pir Saat when we suddenly heard the clopping of quickly approaching hooves, dozens of them. All of a sudden, we were surrounded by Bolshevik Red Army soldiers in their grey-green uniforms and Budenovka hats that looked like woolen spiked helmets pointing their guns at us. There was nothing we could do but surrender. They searched our luggage, and soon it was obvious that we had been smuggling goods from Iran into the country. They didn't care that it was all harmless and useful goods, but started a lengthy discussion in Russian between them which we couldn't follow. We gathered that they were struggling to decide how to divide our goods amongst them, for soon they started to portion them out. They might have also been discussing what to do with us. They could have simply shot us on the spot without facing any retribution, and I am thankful that they didn't. Maybe there was a bounty on smugglers' heads. Anyway, we were tied up on our own mules and taken to a camp several hours away, where they locked us up. By the time we arrived there, the initial shock had given way to a serious fear for our lives. We had no idea what was going to happen to us. During the following days, more prisoners, mainly Iranian Azeris like us, were brought to our cell, and there was hardly enough place for all of us to lie down, and just one bucket for our hygienic needs. Each one of us received a slice of bread per day and some water, nothing else. After several days like that, days of agony and uncertainty, we were suddenly rushed out of our cell at gunpoint. I was sure that they were going to shoot us now. They had gathered many more prisoners from other parts of the camp, too. They led us to a nearby train station, forced us to climb into livestock wagons, and locked us all in. All I could make out from the soldiers shouting was one word: Siberia. The train set off, and we instantly started to discuss what to do. There were no guards inside our wagon. They had locked it from the outside and left us to fend for ourselves. It was a simple old livestock wagon made of wood, and we immediately started to try and break one of the wooden planks. After a while we managed it, and after breaking a second one there was a hole in the wall, just above the floor, big enough for a man to squeeze through. But to our immeasurable horror, right at that moment, the train came to an unexpected halt, and we heard someone working on the outside lock. Had they heard something? We looked at each other, silent and fearful. Then I quickly sat down in front of that hole, covering it with my back and acting as though I was leaning against the wall in exhaustion. The others quickly followed my example and sat down wherever they had been standing. The door opened and 4 armed soldiers entered the wagon, examining us closely. Sweat was dripping down my forehead, and I hoped I wouldn't raise any suspicions. Finally they left again, supposedly satisfied by what they had seen or hadn't seen. The moment the train set off again, I got up, squeezed through the hole, and jumped off the accelerating train, landing hard on the stony ground, but getting up immediately to run away as fast as possible. Unfortunately, I was seen. From the receding train, the Bolshevik soldiers fired at me, but they didn't hit me because the train was gaining speed quickly. From a safe shelter, I watched the train in hopes that my fellow prisoners would jump off the train and follow me, but nobody did. I must have been the only one who escaped that day. My brother went to Siberia and returned home 9 years later, after he finally escaped from the Gulag itself and made the long, dangerous trip to the Soviet Union as a runaway. For his return, my mother organized the biggest feast you can imagine. My own trip back home was not so difficult. Without a mule packed with smuggled goods to identify me, and being a native speaker, who could tell me apart from the locals? People were helpful, too, and after a few days I was back home. I never made the trip to the Soviet part of Azerbaijan again in my life, and that is why my children were born in my homeland, and not in Siberia. 5. Too much of physics, poverty, and wealth. Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray. Rumi. India, 1972 to 73. Manoocher and his father returned to their family in Tehran. Despite the doctor's predictions, he had grown up to be a handsome young man. He finished school and got a decent high school diploma without ever having bothered with studying too much. It was good enough to get into university at least. Now it was time to decide what he wanted to do with his life. In the last few years, he had started to build models of airplanes, so why not become a jet engineer? India was a popular place to study for Iranians. A good quality education at a low price and affordable living costs. He had a friend, Mehdi, who was already studying in Bangalore and who had invited him to stay with him in his dormitory. In an impromptu decision, he'd made up his mind. He was going to Bangalore. One of the many hippies passing through Tehran on their way back from India had left him a backpack as a gift. Manoocher filled it with just the essentials: a few clothes, a transistor radio, and several kilos of pistachios. $100 would have to do for now. Later he would be able to earn whatever he needed. And off he went, on a plane to Mumbai, which at the time was still called Bombay. His plan was to catch the train from there to Bangalore, a trip that would take at least 36 hours. From the airport at Bombay, he managed to find his way to the train station, where it took him some time to identify the right ticket counter. Finally, he stood in front of the person who could sell him a ticket to Bangalore. "I am sorry, sir. The train to Bangalore has just left." "Then I'll take the next one. When is it leaving?" "In 3 days, sir." Manoocher was stuck in Bombay for at least 3 days. He had no idea where to stay. He didn't know anybody, and he didn't know a single thing about this place. He started to walk around. India in the early 1970s was still a place of desperation, of epidemic hunger and ravaging diseases. And Bombay was an aspiring city, drawing thousands of poor Indians who hoped for a better life, for the most part in vain. Manoocher saw extreme poverty all around him, hunger, disease, and cramped spaces. He watched trucks driving slowly through town to pick up the corpses of people who had died in the streets the previous night, having succumbed to hunger and disease. It was the most horrible thing Manoocher had seen so far in his life. For hours he walked, lost, both physically and mentally, not knowing where to go, trying to grasp the incomprehensible cruelty of this extreme penury. At a relatively busy crossroad, he watched the cars passing by, all more or less identical, either Hindustan or Urmia makes, for India had banned the import of all foreign goods. Some of the cars even stopped at the red traffic light. One of the cars had the driver's window rolled down to allow for some breeze, and inside Manoocher saw a young man who looked about his age and familiarly Iranian, with light skin and dark curls. Impulsively, he approached the young man and addressed him in Farsi. "Excuse me, I'm lost. Can you help me find a place to stay?" The driver looked at him blankly. I'm sorry, I don't speak your language. Do you speak English?" "Yes, I do. Sorry, I thought you might be Iranian. You look Iranian." The young man smiled. "In a way, I am. I am Parsi. My ancestors came from Iran. Do you need some kind of help?" "To be honest, yes. I missed my train to Bangalore, and now I'm stuck here and have no idea where I can stay." "Come with me. I'll bring you to my family home. You can stay with us for a few days, and then we'll figure out what you can do. My name is Cyrus, by the way. Get in the car." He made an inviting gesture. "Cyrus the Great! Nice! I'm Manoocher. Thank you so much." It turned out that Cyrus came from a wealthy and extremely hospitable industrialist family. He lived with his parents, his sister, and a small household staff in a vast apartment in one of the better neighborhoods in town. Manoocher ended staying up not only 3 days, but a couple of weeks with Cyrus's family. They showed him around and took him along to fancy dinners and receptions with important people, actors, ambassadors, politicians, and businessmen. All he could offer in return were Iranian pistachios, a precious commodity, at least, in a country that didn't allow imported goods. Cyrus's sister Shirin seemed especially interested in her family's guest. Apparently, she had a crush on him. What made the situation more complicated was that the father was encouraging his daughter's feelings. After 2 weeks, Manoocher insisted that he had to finally leave for Bangalore to start his studies. Cyrus's father took him to one of the factories, a teeming and buzzing place just outside of Bombay. "Look," he said, "why waste your time studying at university? Study life right here. You can stay with us, marry my daughter Shirin, and I will give you this factory as a dowry. You can manage it, and I promise you that you will be settled for life." Manoocher was 18 years old, and the last thing he wanted was to be settled for life, even if it was the most generous offer imaginable. Plus, he preferred to choose his wife himself. "I thank you so much, sir, for your kindest of offers, but I have to refuse. My friend is waiting for me in Bangalore. Please let me go without any hard feelings, and I promise I'll consider your offer." "If you need more time, you can have it. My family owns mansions all over India. If you want to travel and see the country first, you are more than welcome to do so. You will be a welcome guest in every of our houses, and there are always people to take good care of you." Manoocher wanted to take the train, but Cyrus's family insisted on buying him an expensive plane ticket. He was not only taken to the airport by the family driver, no, he was even picked up in Bangalore by a black limousine waiting right there on the tarmac, just below the gangway. The family's Bangalore driver, for they had houses and staff all over India, drove Manoocher and his shabby little backpack to the student dormitory. His school friend Mehdi watched open-mouthed from the dormitory window as Manoocher climbed out of the limousine 2 weeks later than anticipated. Jet engineering quickly turned out not to be what Manoocher had in mind for his future. A 2-year degree in physics was a prerequisite before starting the actual engineering studies, and that was way too theoretical for his taste. He gave it a try for a while, but couldn't get Cyrus's father's offer out of his mind. Not the one about marriage, but the one about traveling India. It simply was too good an opportunity to pass up. For 2 months, Manoocher traveled all over India, this colorful giant of a country, a place of so many contradictions, sleeping in the most luxurious mansions at night and wandering the most desolate slums and villages during the day, seeing human beings who literally lived and died on the streets without any belongings or hope whatsoever. The stark contrast between extreme poverty and sumptuous wealth was too much. During the day he felt like a helpless foreigner, witnessing human misery and not being able to do anything about it, and at night he was in a golden cage, served and spoiled. Overwhelmed by his contrast, he stopped shaving and hardly ate. At the end of his grand tour, Manoocher was but a shadow of himself. He eventually returned to Bangalore, where he found his friend Mehdi despairing over his physics studies. Together they decided that this has not been what they had expected and that they needed to change their plans. I have a cousin in Germany, Jalal is his name, in a town in the north called Kiel. He studied there and now he teaches at a university. I think that's the place to go. What do you think? You want to come with me? Decision-making still was easy in those years. Sure, why not? Manoocher sold his last precious possession, the transistor radio, which gave him a good amount of cash because it was a rare foreign product. With that, he bought plane tickets via Amsterdam to Hamburg. 6. Returns. Experience is what you get while looking for something else. Federico Fellini. Iran, 1973 to 75. In those days, Iranian passport holders hardly needed a visa for any country. Therefore, Manoocher and Mehdi confidently stepped off their airplane in Hamburg to line up for passport control and to enter into Germany to start their studies all over again. When it was their turn, the border control officer, a giant German policeman, asked, "Your passports, please." They handed them over. "You are Iranian?" "Yes, sir," Manoocher replied. "Why are you traveling to Germany?" "We're going to study at university." "Are you already inscribed at a university?" "No, not yet. We wanted to do that when we arrived." "Which city were you planning to go to?" "To Kiel." "Do you have a place to stay there?" "Yes, we do. I have a relative who teaches at a university there." "Do you have money on you?" "Not that much, to be honest." Manoocher had about $10 left, and Mehdi didn't have much more on him. "I can't let you enter Germany." "Why not? We have valid passports." "You will take the next plane back to where you came from." "Seriously? Why? Listen, this is not okay. We've come all the way here, we don't need a visa, and we have a place to go. What's the problem?" "No problem if you go back to where you come from." "But—" The policeman stood up, towering high over Manoocher, who barely reached his shoulder. Mehdi pinched his arm, whispering, "This guy is 3 times your size. Don't make him angry." They were sent back on a plane to Amsterdam, where they were locked up overnight in a cell along with several other travelers, all of Middle Eastern origin, mostly Palestinians, and sent back to Iran the next day. What on earth had happened? It must have been the timing. After the Yom Kippur War had just broken out, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries curbed their output in order to put pressure on Western states supporting Israel, causing the first oil crisis. Tensions were high. There was probably some kind of terror alert, and the attacks on the Israeli athletes during the Olympic Games in Munich the previous year likely hadn't helped to establish a welcoming atmosphere. One had to admit, though, that Manoocher looked especially ragged and skinny, which probably didn't give the impression of an upstanding citizen. In short, the 2 boys looked a little too fishy, and so they were pigeonholed as suspects or something of other. Nobody considered it necessary to tell them of what, and sent them back home, valid travel papers or not. When Manoocher arrived home to Tehran late at night, unexpectedly, his mother Nezakat opened the door and cried out over her son's appearance. Manoocher, oh my God, what did they do to you? He hugged her. I'm fine, Mama, don't worry. Come in, you need something to eat. You look as if you didn't eat for months. It was good to be home. Coming home had been nice for the moment, but it brought one major disadvantage. It meant imminent draft to military service. Service. What a nice, innocent word. It brings to mind polite kindness and helpful assistance. The words drill and deprivation describe the following 6 months of military basic training much, much better. Manoocher was assigned to a garrison deep in the mountains where the soldiers were snowed in for weeks on time and temperatures were frequently as low as negative 30 degrees Celsius. The officers were so corrupt that they stole the gasoline destined to heat the poorly insulated military barracks, meaning that the recruits' dormitories, crammed with narrow bunk beds, were constantly way below the freezing point. One wonders whether they were of the opinion that only the experience of almost freezing to death makes a real man. What did they do in the desert barracks, then? Deprive the conscripts of water? Or if it was simply pure greed? They stole their food too, meaning that the recruits had to cope with the most meagre of meals possible, scanty soups and thin porridges with some stale bread. Each day at dawn, or sometimes even in the middle of the night, the training officer would blow a whistle 3 times. At the third blow of the whistle, each of the recruits had to stand fully dressed and ready next to their made beds, which was only possible because the recruits slept in their uniforms to combat the cold, and even that was insufficient to withstand the climate. In order to do sentry duty, the recruits borrowed their comrades' clothes and wore several uniform jackets on top of the other, just to not freeze to death. Nevertheless, one day one of the comrades didn't return from his guard. They only found his bloody, ragged clothes, his boots, a gun stuck in the ground on its bayonet, and a dead wolf. The other wolves had killed and eaten the half-frozen young man. The events were reconstructed as follows. First, a single wolf had attacked the recruit, who, his gun jammed by the cold, had defended himself with a bayonet and killed the wolf. He then must have stuck the bloody blade into the ground next to him, where the wolf's blood had frozen solidly to the surrounding ice and soil, so that the soldier wasn't able to draw his weapon when the whole pack attacked. For the officers, this didn't signal any reason to change anything about the recruit's situation. There was a positive side to all this, though. Manoocher was assigned to the so-called Army of Knowledge, soldiers who were sent out to bring literacy, education, and basic infrastructure to the most remote villages which had thus far been untouched by any state institution or 20th century development. 19-year-old boys who were supposed to represent at least a hint of state structures in otherwise clan-based societies. Which meant that the recruits, during their base training after the morning drill, were taught many different subjects such as basic architecture, first aid, pedagogy, psychology, some engineering, and law, all with practical purpose. They had sports classes too. The sports teacher, a chain smoker who constantly smoked cigarettes in class, on the sports field, and everywhere else, never sat down. The problem with smoking, he stated, is sitting down. When you stand or walk while smoking, it won't hurt your health. It's even helpful because you stay active. After 6 months of general and military training, the soldiers in the Army of Knowledge were deemed prepared for the huge task that lay ahead of them. Each of them was assigned to one remote village to single-handedly develop it. Take some money to feed the school children, here's your kerosene lamp, and off you go. Good luck. Manoocher was sent to spend the next 18 months in a small mountain village, another ice-cold place that was snowed in for weeks at a time, between Hamadan and Malayir that had a few mud brick houses, no roads, no school, no sewage system, no water, no electricity, no law enforcement, but plenty of goats and a mullah. The villagers eyed with suspicion this very young man in uniform who suddenly was supposed to be both their teacher and their judge. He made himself at home with his few belongings in one of the mud houses, keeping warm by fueling his little petroleum oven with petroleum that had to be brought to the village on the back of a donkey, just like everything else. One evening he had just started to prepare himself a simple meal when he heard voices outside getting louder, arguing, shouting, apparently in anger. He stepped out in the open to see what was going on and walked to the village center, calling it square would be a stretch, only to find two families in a violent argument over some banal issue. He could make out the words donkey and field. They were already starting to swing at each other with sticks and pitchforks. Manoocher ran towards the scene, got between the fighting parties, and, as nobody was taking any notice of him, fired some blanks into the air. The villagers immediately withdrew from their brawl, and from that day forward they accepted the presence of the foreigner. It was as if he had passed a crucial test. The mullah of the village even offered his daughter's hand. A simple school building was constructed under his supervision. He built public bathrooms, had a road built, instructed the children at school in the morning, and gave them a daily breakfast, and taught the adults to read and write in the evenings. He was starting to feel satisfied about the slow but steady progress that the village was making. He made sure to buy as much of the provisions he needed for school breakfast as he could from the local villagers, and only import by donkey the things from town that were locally unavailable, which actually were quite a few. After 4 months, the military supervisor came to check the situation and the finances. At least that was his official purpose. The real one was to get a bribe from Manoocher, part of the money that was supposed to go to giving the children breakfast in order to file a positive report. If not, "You're doing very well," he said. "Now, if you give me 50 tuman, I'll write a good report about you." 50 tuman? But that's all I got. I needed to buy food for the children. The supervisor raised his eyebrow. "I mean, I need them, sir," Manoocher quickly added. "You wouldn't want me to write anything bad about you, would you?" "Of course not, sir, but I cannot leave the children without breakfast. Look, this is a very poor village, and many of the children go hungry if they don't get their extra meal. I didn't ask you for a report on the local children. I asked for 50 tuman. I cannot give them to you, sir." "Are you sure, recruit?" "Yes, sir." The supervisor reported that upon his arrival the soldier was absent from the village and that he had misused the money destined for buying food. Military police came to arrest Manoocher and brought him to the nearest military garrison, where he was questioned by the supervisor's superior. He asked me to give him a bribe so he would write a positive report, but I refused because the village children really need those meals. "I see, but that isn't a problem, you know. Just give the money to me instead, and your little problem will be solved in no time." It would be tempting to write that Manoocher couldn't believe his ears at this point, but it's more likely that he didn't have any illusions about the virtuousness, or lack thereof, of army officials. Nevertheless, he remained firm. "No, I will not pay any bribe. I have not done anything wrong." And so he went to military prison for 1 week before being returned to his village. 1 week wasn't long, and totally worth the preservation of his integrity. Upon his return, he took up his daily chores again, teaching, organizing, and sometimes even settling local disputes. It was the beginning of September now, and the days were already getting shorter, but were still sunny, warm, and pleasant. It was one of those afternoons that Manoocher saw 3 completely unexpected people walking up the dirt road through the village. His mother, his father, and his cousin Jalal from Germany. He closed his eyes, opened them again to see if they were still there, and then pinched himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. "Mama June, Agha June, Jalal, what are you doing here? How did you get here?" He hugged them, one after the other. "Manoocher, it is so good to see you," Yadullah said. "You look quite well. We had to leave the car down where the road ends and had to walk up. Jalal is visiting us for a few weeks, and he offered to drive us here. We brought you a few things from home." "Thank you so much. I'm so happy to see you, but why did you come all the way up here? My military service is almost finished. I'll be home soon." "We have bad news," said Nezakat. "They arrested your brother Reza." "What? Who? I mean, why?" "The CIAK, of course, the Shah's secret service. They caught him distributing posters calling for democracy and an end to corruption. We don't know where he is now. They don't let us visit him or tell us when the process is or anything else." She was nearly crying. "But this is insane. What can I do?" "Don't do anything. That is why we came here, to let you know. Please don't get into trouble yourself. We heard they already put you in prison for a week." She rubbed her temples with her hands. "That was nothing." Manoocher made a dismissive gesture. It was because I refused to give the supervisor a bribe. We know, but please be careful now. They might be watching you too. One son in prison is more than enough. Promise? Promise. They were not able to visit Reza for another year. When he was finally released, after 2 years of being tortured in prison, Nezakat organized the biggest feat their neighborhood had ever seen, even bigger than the one her mother-in-law had organized for his son's return from the Russian Gulag. Meanwhile, Manoocher tried to stay out of trouble, at least for the time being. Instead, he used his days to travel the whole of Iran, from Tabriz to Zahedan and from Bushehr to Mashhad, in a ramshackle Citroën 2CV, witnessing the precarious social and political situation, working on his photography skills, and earning his money by building models for architects' offices. 7. All roads lead to Rome. Travel brings power and love back into your life. Rumi. The Balkans, 1975. Italian cinema had arrived to Iran, and it was particularly neorealism and its representatives that blew Manoocher's mind. Visconti, Rossellini, Pasolini, Fellini, the stories they told in their movies about post-war Italy were so close to the Iranian reality. Social drama, the traditional role of religion, an awakening society, drama, symbolism, strong characters, and even stronger images, it was all there. After going to the cinema as frequently as possible to watch the subtitled movies, he made up his mind. He wasn't a technician, he was a storyteller, and so he wanted to become a filmmaker, not just anywhere, but in Italy. And Italy for movie makers meant Rome. The old backpack was quickly packed. Some clothes, a toothbrush, and pistachios. What else do you need in life? And off he went to the train station. His first destination was Istanbul. The train ride from Tehran to the Turkish metropolis took 4 days, in which travelers met, got to know each other, exchanged stories, and became friends. The train conductor ran a semi-official little opium den in one of the compartments, earning himself some good pocket money. Manoocher made the acquaintance of a group of wealthy Iranians who were on their way back to Italy to buy fancy cars and drive them all the way back to Iran. Because none of them spoke a word of Turkish and they were lost in Istanbul, they hired Manoocher, who, as a native Azeri speaker, could make himself understood in Turkish. They paid him a couple of days of food and accommodation in Istanbul before all of them continued their journey through the Balkans towards Italy. Somehow things always worked out for him. It was a trip behind the Iron Curtain of Cold War Europe. Border crossings invariably took hours. From the train windows, the passengers could see vast landscapes with peasants working in the fields, dotted with huge monuments in the middle of nowhere. Everything seemed to be grey. During stops at some of the bigger train stations, passengers were allowed to leave the train to replenish their supplies of food, drinks, and tobacco, which peasant women in dark headscarves sold to them. Numerous soldiers in long, heavy coats and broad, dark, peaked caps were watching everyone's coming and going attentively. It had gotten cold again. People in the train station, both soldiers and civilians, drank rakia, the local strong liquor that came in the most astonishing colors, to warm up. The food seemed heavy and greasy, but that was probably necessary to cope with the rakia. The train had just left the station in Belgrade when one of Manoocher's travel's companions cried out, "Where is Akbar?" "What do you mean, where is Akbar? He isn't here? I didn't see him get on the train again. Did you?" "No, me neither." The other companion looked out the window at the receding train station. In the distance, he could make out a person in the platform waving frenetically. "There he is! He's still there! We left Akbar at the station. His things are all here, his bag, his jacket, everything. His passport and his jacket. Let me do it." Manoocher said spontaneously. He grabbed Akbar's and his own belongings, pulled the emergency brake, and flung the next door open, jumping out of the nearly stopped train. All of a sudden, he remembered the story of his father's escape from the Soviet prisoners' transport. The train's brakes were creaking behind him as he ran back towards the train station. Somebody, probably a conductor, shouted something, but Manoocher could no longer hear him. He reached the train station and walked up to the stunned Akbar and the even more astonished bystanders. "Here's your stuff. What happened? Why didn't you get back to the train in time?" I was looking for cigarettes. I guess I lost track of the time. I guess you did. So what now? They looked at the train that had taken up speed again and was quickly receding. That one's gone. Let's ask for the next train. Somehow, with the help of miming and lots of patience, they managed to ask for the next train going to Italy. There would be another one stopping at the station the next day, no problem. But they had to spend the night in Belgrade. First, they walked around looking for a hotel, but there was none to be found. No hostel, no room for rent. Either there were none, or they were all occupied, or nobody wanted to give them an address. Akbar and Manoocher spent the night moving from tavern to tavern and from bar to bar until the last watering hole finally closed, which meant they set up camp on the station bench until the morning when the first cafes opened. Strangely enough, throughout this adventure in nocturnal Belgrade, they had not been stopped or questioned by any member of the Yugoslavian police or army. 8. Mamma Roma. The cinema is an explosion of my love for reality. Pier Paolo Pasolini. Italy, 1975 to 78. Eventually, they made it to the Italian capital. Glorious, gorgeous, vibrant, chaotic, eternal Rome, and several days later they somehow managed to find Akbar's friends. Manoocher can't recall how they managed it. They didn't even have a phone number or address. Somehow things always miraculously worked out in those days. Manoocher didn't speak much Italian yet, but that was a minor issue. A mix of English, some Italian, and gestures would get the job done in his first few weeks. He'd learned the language quickly enough now that he was living in Rome. The other, more urgent problem was finding a place to stay. One of Akbar's friends had a son who studied in Rome. Manoocher stayed with him for a couple of days while looking for a low-budget accommodation. On his second day, at the Academy of Fine Arts, a male student with long golden hair and a blonde beard came up to him. "Hi, you wouldn't happen to have a cigarette, would you?" "Sure. Here, I'll join you." "Mille grazie. My name is Andrea, by the way." He stretched out his hand. Manoocher shook it. "Manu, nice to meet you." "My pleasure." "Listen, I'm looking for a place to stay. You don't happen to know a place?" "Actually, I do. I just moved here to study here myself and found a tiny studio, but I don't have much money. Actually, it's only one room with a small kitchen corner and a bathroom outside, but I'd be happy to share it." And so it was decided. Studio was quite a euphemism. Den would have been a more appropriate term. In the end, they squeezed in a bunk bed and lived in that room with 4 people. Andrea and varying girlfriends on the bed below, and Manoocher and his girlfriend Patrizia, finding a girlfriend hadn't taken long, on the bed above. The kitchen corner was just big enough to cook pasta for the 4 of them. It was perfect. He enrolled at CIAK Film School to become a cinematographer. The professor for camera technique was an ex-US Army cameraman who had served in Italy during World War II, found the love of his life, married her, and stayed. It was a time of experimental art in a city buzzing with exciting movie projects. Federico Fellini was currently working on his Satiricon. The students paid their bills by building models for an architect's office. Andrea, who studied art history, went home to his parents' place every few weeks to stock up on Mamma's home-cooked food. He was originally from the central Italian Abruzzo region, which wasn't too far from Rome, depending on your means of transportation. In the rusty 2CV that Andrea drove, it was an expedition, especially on the way back, when the trunk was so stuffed it almost touched the ground. Andrea started to take Manoocher along to his family's place every now and then. On the first of these trips, he introduced him to his old grandmother. "Nonna, this is Manoocher. He comes from Iran and studies in Rome, like me." "Welcome, welcome, young man. You are from abroad, aren't you? Tell me, how does Andrea behave? Is he a good boy?" she asked in a thick Abruzzese accent. Manoocher didn't understand a word and looked puzzled. "Nonna, Manoocher isn't from here. He doesn't understand what you're saying." "I said, welcome, young man. How is Andrea doing in Rome?" she repeated, now much louder, almost shouting. "Why are you shouting like that?" Andrea asked her. "I told you, he can't understand you." "Exactly. That's why I'm shouting, so that he can understand me." It was on that same trip that they were invited to a communion party. Now, First Communion is serious business in Italy and is celebrated almost like a wedding. It was the first Italian family feast Manoocher had been invited to. The weather was beautiful now in early summer at the foot of the Gran Sasso mountain. Long tables set with immaculately white tablecloths had been arranged out in the open, with lots of space around for the children to play and run and leave the adults alone to drink and eat in peace. There were at least 50 guests. The starters arrived, plenty of antipasti, cheese, salami, different kinds of flatbreads, pickled vegetables, slices of different kinds of frittata, and wine was served generously. Manoocher drank and ate and was merry. Then the pasta dish arrived. He took another helping because it was a good one. After that, another pasta dish arrived, and then another and another. Altogether, 12 pasta dishes were served. Manoocher woke up on a sofa inside the adjacent house to somebody fanning air at him and someone else coming running with a glass of water. He had fainted at the table from overeating, not accustomed to the abundance of a full Italian festive menu, and he hadn't even reached the main course. Manoocher learned proper Italian, went on with his studies, and mingled with revolutionary students. All in all, a pleasant time for a curious student. He followed the debates in various newspapers, among them articles by Adriano Sofri in the Lotta Continua, the homonymous movement's magazine. Patrizia and her friends took him along to the demonstrations, so why not use the opportunity to shoot his first photo story about the protests? The next demonstration was the big Women's March on March 8th, International Women's Day, which of course he supported. He took his camera, joined Patrizia and a few of her friends, and started documenting the banners, the women participating, and the protests in general, entering deeper into the physical center of the demonstrations, where the most radical feminists had marked their territory. Not realizing that he was the only man around, he continued to take photos until somebody nearby started to scream, "He's a man! There's a man here! He's taking photos!" Manoocher looked up and looked into the faces of a good dozen women staring at him, some of them pointing. With a reconciliatory gesture, he tried to back away, but was quickly encircled by more women shouting, "Down with men! He's a spy! Cut off his balls!" He looked around. There was only one way out. He sprinted towards the nearest house, an old building with high ceilings and several floors, windows with iron bars, several balconies, and a stable-looking drain pipe. Jumping up onto the windowsill, he made his way up with the help of the window bars and the drain pipe until he was dangling above the crowd on the balcony of a first-floor apartment, to the sheer amusement of the protesters below. They quickly got distracted, though, by the sight of 2 more men having strayed into the wrong part of the demonstration. They were less quick in their escape, and Manoocher could watch from his precarious viewing points how they were stripped naked by the crowd and chased off amidst gloating laughter. Manoocher was rather happy to be in the position he was, from where he continued to take pictures. The demonstrations moved on, and with it the extremist group. Patrizia turned up with her friends under the balcony. "You can come down now. They're gone." He jumped. That was his first, rather unexpected, encounter with covering a demonstration gone fluey. The 4 people then got a little crowded over time, and Manoocher looked forward to moving into a slightly bigger space. He found an apartment to share with a few friends near Nero's tomb at number 98 Via Gradoli, and moved in. One day, it must have been April 18th, 1978, he returned home from classes in the evening, only to find that the entire street had been blocked by police forces. He approached one of the officers. "Excuse me, what's going on? Why do you want to know?" "Well, I live here. I'd like to go home." "Can you show me your ID?" "Sure, here it is." He gave it to the policeman, who studied it carefully. "Iranian, eh?" "Yes." "Studying in Italy?" "Yes, cinema." "Do you have the key to your apartment?" "Of course." "Can I see it?" "Sure, but what's going on?" "I can't tell you. You may pass now. My colleague here will accompany to your house." And so he did. The whole street was packed with policemen and carabinieri in uniform, as well as other men in civilian clothes, presumably plainclothes officers. Several police, carabinieri, and even military cars lined the street. The whole crowd seemed focused on the neighboring house, number 96. What on earth was going on? Most of the neighbors were watching the spectacle from their windows and balconies. One of Manoocher's neighbors stood in front of the door of house number 98, smoking silently. Buonasera, signore. What is happening here? Do you know? They found the place where Moro was being kept. What? Aldo Moro? Right here? Seriously? Seems like it. Aldo Moro was the former Italian prime minister and head of the Christian Democrat Party. He had been kidnapped by the Red Brigades the previous month, and since then the entire country had been turned upside down to find him. Information was released only sparsely to the public. In the end, it turned out that this apartment in the Via Gradoli had been a terrorist hideout, yes, but it had not been the place where Aldo Moro was being held captive. His body was found 3 weeks later inside a car in central Rome. To this day, there is much speculation in Italy about who knew what, or even who gave which order at what time, and who else was involved in the moderate politician's kidnapping and murder. Among other candidates, the CIA, the Mafia, and the pseudo-Masonic right-wing P2 Lodge have been accused of involvement, or at least of seizing the opportunity of getting rid of an all-too-conciliatory politician. That same year, demonstrations broke out in Iran, demanding an end to corruption and to the unpopular Shah's regime. With his cinematography diploma in hand, Manoocher returned to Iran to be part of a hopeful new and democratic Iran, or at least to document the protests. He drove back all the way from Rome to Iran, through Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Turkey, in an expensive new car that another rich Iranian had bought and paid Manoocher to bring to Tehran. 9. Revolution. O Mufti, you go more astray than I do, though to wine I do give way. I drink the blood of grapes, you that of men. Which of us is the more bloodthirsty, pray? Omar Khayyam. Iran, 1978-79. On Manoocher's first day back, he headed off, camera in hand, to roam the streets of Tehran. Everywhere people were on the street protesting, against corruption, against the Shah, for more democracy. Over and over the protests were crushed violently by the Shah's soldiers. He wandered through the city center and photographed the events and people around him. An open truck full of soldiers slowly rolled past him, its diesel engine roaring. Upon seeing Manoocher, one of the soldiers on the truck bed loaded his rifle and took a shot at him. He could hear the bullets whistle on both sides of his head, but miraculously he wasn't hit, and the bullets struck the wall behind him. Dust and slivers of concrete hit him in the face. He immediately threw himself to the ground, looking for cover, but the truck simply rolled away, out of sight. Passers-by came flocking, pointing at the man on the ground. "Oh my God, they shot him! He's a shaheed, a martyr!" Manoocher lifted his head and looked around. "No, I'm not a martyr. They missed. It's okay, I'm fine." He was alive, but shocked that this soldier had just shot at him without apparent reason, until it dawned on him that he had been targeted because he had been taking photos. The thought that photos were that feared by the authorities only reinforced his determination to document the events. The Ashura festival was coming up, during which Shia Muslims commemorate the death of Imam Hussein during the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE. The festival is an important commemoration day in Iran, a kind of feast day in which people in all towns and villages flock to the streets and squares to attend the colorfully enacted passion plays or even injure themselves during public self-flagellation ceremonies. This year, though, the Ashura festival culminated in the biggest political demonstration that world history had ever seen. Millions of citizens protested against the Shah, and on this day something very special happened. The military did not take action against the protesters. Whether they simply wanted to prevent a bloodbath or secretly agreed with the protesters' aims is anyone's guess, but many ordinary soldiers defected to the revolutionaries that day. Manoocher took pictures the entire day, of the crowds, of armored military vehicles stopping and letting soldiers get out, even of some soldiers in uniform who had defected being carried triumphantly through the streets on the shoulders of the cheering protesters. "They're on our side! They're on our side!" people shouted. That day turned everything around. Only a few weeks later, the Shah was deposed and fled the country. A new government was proclaimed and entrusted with reforms. Everything seemed to be going well. Few knew that a very specific part of society did not consider the revolution over at all and was planning yet another overthrow. But before that would happen, a completely different blow of fate struck down the euphoria in Manoocher's family. He and Reza were now sharing a little studio in central Tehran to stay close to the events. One evening their phone rang. "Hello? Manoocher, is that you? Something terrible happened. Come now, please." "But Mama, what happened? Tell me." In the background he could hear loud weeping. His mother's voice sounded broken. "Your sister Parivash." She paused before continuing with apparent difficulty. "She's dead." "What? What do you mean? What happened? Come here, please, both of you." "We're coming right away." Manoocher slammed his hand against the wall until it hurt. Parivash had died while giving birth to her second child. Due to the revolution and the resulting chaos, the hospitals were not functioning properly. They lacked medication, banked blood, disinfectants, and staff. She and her unborn child died after a complication of a stupid, preventable medical malpractice. The whole family was devastated. Parivash, who had always laughed, who was always singing or playing music, left a mourning husband and a little son behind, Sohail, who would, they decided, grow up with his grandparents. The world outside was also gearing up for more calamity. Ayatollah Khomeini, who had used clever tactics and populist statements to become known as the chief revolutionary, was still in French exile. Some Iranians claimed to have seen his face on the moon or to have found one of his hairs between the pages of the Quran. In widely broadcasted interviews with journalists from around the globe, he affirmed that he welcomed the democratic change in his country, that the clergy would never go into politics, and that by no means he was aiming for power, that he wanted to go back to the city of Qom upon his return to Iran to teach theology. He emphasized the equal role of women, both during the revolution but also for the country's future. Therefore, the French government organized his flight from French exile to Iran. Khomeini's first public address on the day of his return, February 1st, 1979, in Tehran's biggest cemetery, which he had chosen as the venue for his speech, sounded entirely different. He was greeted by calls of "Khomeini for king!" He must have taken them very literally indeed, for he immediately made it clear that he was planning to seize power and to establish a theocracy, a reign of mullahs. "I have appointed the government. I have godly authority and the nation must obey. This is not an ordinary government. It is a government based on the Sharia. To disagree with it means to disagree with the laws of Islam. Revolt against God's government is a revolt against God. Revolt against God is blasphemy." So much for democracy. Now the mullahs showed their true faces. The Iranian clergy must have been preparing for this moment because the mullahs suddenly carried weapons and had a heavily armed paramilitary extremely ready to use violence at their side. The Pasdaran, the so-called guardians of the revolution, who claimed to control everybody and everything. Suppression by the self-proclaimed revolutionary guards sneaked into society slowly. At first, those who the seething populace would miss least were eliminated: army generals, rich industrialists, and estate owners whose property was seized. Slowly, and even cleverly, they extended the persecution to all kinds of political opposition and freethinkers. Women were obliged to go veiled. The media, television, radio, cinemas, music, concerts, were strictly censored. Women were banned from singing in public. The popular hits of the 1960s and 70s were suddenly considered un-Islamic and taboo. Only few months after Khomeini's return, the first public executions took place in the streets. Manoocher tried to document as much as possible with his camera. One evening, when he wanted to capture the unspeakable, he saw that a scaffold had once again been erected to publicly hang opposition members. Ayatollah Khalkhali, supreme judge of the revolutionary courts and hangman of the revolution, had ordered the construction of additional gallows in the streets of Tehran. The condemned men were anonymous. Sacks had been pulled over their faces, and their hands were tied behind their backs. Nobody read out their names, informed their next of kin, or even let them say goodbye. One after the other, they had a noose laid around their necks while they stood on boxes. Some cried, some prayed, others stood completely still, be it from resignation or a last attempt at dignity. Nobody begged for his life. It was clear to everyone that all hope was lost. When all the doomed men were finally lined up under the gallows, the pastaran started to kick away the boxes on which they were standing. One after another fell, and the noose tightened around their necks. However, after only a few seconds, the iron scaffold, the improvised gallows, started to buckle and collapsed. It could not stand up to the weight of so many bodies. Drowned out by the surprise outcries of the onlookers, the manacled and masked people fell helplessly to the ground. The pastaran, though, did not think twice, and shot each one of them unceremoniously with a bullet in the head. Pools of blood spread out on the tarmac. Nobody ever learned the names of those executed. Meanwhile, the clashes between the opponents of the new theocracy, Democrats, leftists, human rights activists, and general advocates of a laic state, and the paid thugs of the regime, the Basijis, became more and more brutal. One day, during a protest which Manoocher wanted to photograph, Basijis started stabbing some of the protesters to death and marching off others to an uncertain destiny. They spared no one, and certainly no journalists. Manoocher escaped to the rooftop of a nearby house, partly to get out of harm's way and partly to have a better view for capturing the situation. For several minutes he could see people being beaten up, murdered or taken away, both men and women. Then one of the thugs discovered him. "Hey, up there! Somebody's up there!" he shouted. "Where?" "Up on the roof. He's taking pictures." "We'll get him." There was no way out. Only one staircase led up to the rooftop. Manoocher quickly hid the film rolls he had shot so far inside a pile of rubbish which the inhabitants of that house must have accumulated over the years. He would have to talk himself out of the situation. At least he had an official press card. An armed goon squad came running up the stairs and towards him. "Brothers, Manoocher didn't get further than that, as the fist of the first man that reached him had hit him hard in the face. "Save him for me, brothers! I'll shoot this damned photographer right in the eye tonight." His mates broke Manoocher's camera and frog-marched him down the stairs, into one of the cars waiting by the roadside. They brought him to a police station that had been taken over by the Revolutionary Committee, which was now using its cells for their own prisoners. Nobody listens to his protests of being a journalist. On the contrary, that only led to more violence. He was shoved into one of the cells. Talking to these people was impossible. Slowly it dawned on him that his life was in serious danger. Hours passed without anybody taking any notice of him. Prisoners were fetched from the surrounding cells to never return. Gunshots could be heard from the courtyard. Evening arrived and the police station emptied, of prisoners as well as Basijis. Manoocher was still locked in his cell and sat on the bare wooden bench, the only piece of furniture in the room. Eventually, a regular policeman in uniform approached the bars. "One left," he muttered to himself. He unlocked the door with a key on a big, clinking keyring and stepped into the cell. "Listen, this is a misunderstanding. I'm a journalist accredited by the Ministry of Islamic Guidance. Let me go," Manoocher pleaded. The policeman looked at him sympathetically and shook his head. "I can't. I have my orders. I'm sorry." And he left again, closing the door behind him. But one noise was missing, Manoocher thought. The policeman hadn't turned the key. He hadn't locked the door. He listened for some seconds, his heart pounding, then approached the door, carefully pulling it. It opened with a faint creak. He listened again. No movements. Silently he walked along the empty corridor, along empty cells, into the entry hall of the police station. Nobody was to be seen. He held his breath and tried the entry door. Strangely, it was open. And then he ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, ran across half of Tehran until he was home. Either the Basijis had forgotten him, or they had wanted to save him for the next day. The policeman had saved his life. Best of all, the next day he found the film rolls where he had hastily hidden them. The first coordinated act of war by the new regime was directed at the Kurdish population of its own country, who had sensed a chance for statehood after being denied seats in the Constituent Assembly. The army of the Islamic Republic replied with maximum force, bombarding settlements and besieging several Kurdish towns. Manoocher was traveling in the mountains with a group of Kurdish fighters from the Komala movement to document the conflict. They traveled from village to village, again and again finding bombed-out houses and the corpses of their killed inhabitants, partisans and civilians alike. He stayed for a few days in the Kurdish town of Sanandaj, where people were running out of provisions and were threatened by grenade and rocket strikes day after day and night after night. The death toll rose daily. Manoocher shared the inhabitants' lives, hardly eating or sleeping. After some days, one of the Komala commanders came to the house in which he was staying. Sanandaj is locked in by the Revolutionary Guards, he said. There is only one way left to leave town, but even that will be closed soon. You are not one of us fighters. You have to leave to tell our story. We're going to get you out now. Manoocher packed his belongings, his camera, and the many film rolls he had shot in the past 2 weeks, and was driven by a group of heavily armed guerrillas in a rattle-trap jeep via bumpy detours to the main street towards Kermanshah. There, on the road halfway to Kermanshah, they dropped him off. From here, there are still buses to Kermanshah. If you wait here, one should pass soon. Good luck. And off they went in their jeep. The inhabitants of Sanandaj needed luck more than he did, Manoocher thought. After standing around for a while, he sat down on the dusty roadside and took a deep breath. He had to make it back to Tehran without raising the suspicion of the Revolutionary Guards. To do so, he had to deceive them. He needed a plan. About an hour later, he saw a bus approaching. He jumped up and waved. The bus braked and stopped, and the door opened. "Does this bus go to Kermanshah?" he asked. "Yes, to the bus station." He got in, paid his ticket, and sat down. Slowly, a plan began to form in his head. Upon arrival in Kermanshah, he immediately set out for the local military airbase and demanded to see the commander. "What do you want to see the commander for?" the guard on duty asked. "I'm a journalist coming from the front line. I have a message for the commander." They let him in. "Brother," he addressed the commander, "I have photographed this war alongside the Revolutionary Guards and have some important pictures that document the heroic fight of our brothers. It's urgent that I bring them to Tehran where they are needed." He was playing a risky game, but if the commander didn't bother to confirm his story, it should work. And it did. They flew him in a military plane to the capital. The plane landed on a military base near Tehran, where he was received by a saluting soldier who showed him the way to the city. He was able to leave the military base unharmed. Of course, the photos were not destined to serve as state propaganda, but instead had to be quickly delivered to an international news agency. But that could wait until tomorrow. He hadn't slept properly for days. He had been tense the whole time, and he was sweaty and dusty. The first thing he did at home was to run himself a hot bath. He was choking. Someone had laid a wet cloth over his mouth and nose and firmly pressed it onto his face. It was dark. He couldn't breathe. He tried to breathe with his mouth, but only swallowed more water. Suddenly he woke up, spitting and spluttering water. He must have fallen asleep in the bathtub and had almost drowned in it. In the meantime, the water had become ice cold. He looked down at his body. All his skin was sodden and wrinkly. He must have laid there for hours. 10. No UFO in the desert. Poor soul, you will never know anything of real importance. You will not uncover even one of life's secrets. Although all religions promise paradise, take care to create your own paradise, here and now on earth. Omar Khayyam. Iran, 1979-1980. Every day Manoocher took to the streets, where there was always something going on. People came to have a look at the spectacle. Life-sized effigies of international politicians got hanged from bridges, flags were burned, there were banners, posters, and all kinds of attention seekers. People came with a whole family, and there was something for everyone. The atmosphere was that of a fairground. One could buy grilled corn cobs, roasted sunflower seeds, and other snacks. Tehran's snack shops had moved their activities here, with vendors selling food from trays strapped around their necks or from barbecues on wheels. All of these festivities were due to what was going on in the nearby building, the U.S. Embassy. For several weeks now, the embassy had been occupied by radical students, and the American embassy staff had been taken hostage. Since that day, the world's attention had been directed towards Iran, and Tehran's inhabitants, likewise, liked to keep up to date on the latest developments. Each day, a committee of hostage-takers stepped out on the embassy roof to read a statement or simply to chant slogans, which the crowd enthusiastically joined in on. Sometimes they revealed photos that showed the hostages writing letters or otherwise passing the time of their captivity. With every day that passed without incident, the hostage takers grew more confident, and the young Islamic Republic felt more powerful. Manoocher mingled with the crowd to capture the mood. At the end of the street, an effigy of US President Carter was hung from a bridge, click, near the wall, where there was an American wife of an Iranian fighter pilot who, surrounded by onlookers, burned the flag of her homeland, click. And in the middle of the street was, as usual, the guy who, surrounded by his buddies, was trying to garner the attention of the crowd and the photographers with posters he had painted himself. Today he had brought a large poster of the Shah as a Zahak, a diabolical figure from Persian mythology, with painted horns on his temples and snakes coming from his shoulders, which he now tore apart and burned piece by piece. It is, by the way, astonishingly tricky to burn a flag without using a combustive agent. By using one, though, protesters risk accidentally setting themselves on fire. That's how all of the 444 days of the hostage crisis went by, or nearly all of them. One morning, in April 1980, a strange rumor was going around. Several unidentified flying objects were said to have been sighted in the Dasht-e-Kavir desert near Tabas. One of them was even said to have descended. A crashed UFO? In Iran? Manoocher couldn't miss out on that one. But Tabas was about 1,000 kilometers away from Tehran, and some of the roads leading there were nothing but dirt roads. How could he get there in a reasonable amount of time? First, he asked all the international news agencies if they knew any details. No, they had no clue either. So there was only one possibility left, to go on his own. And to do so, he would have to fly. He drove to the airport and went straight to the information desk. Excuse me, he said. When is the next flight going to Mashhad? Mashhad was the closest place to Tabas that had a civil airport. In 10 minutes, but the gate is closed, all passengers have already boarded, and the plane is due to take off at any moment. It's crucial that I get on that flight. I'm sorry, but Manoocher pulled out his press card and held it up to the airport employee's face. In those days, press cards were issued by the Ministry for Islamic Guidance and bore its logo. At first glance, they almost looked like the ID cards of the Revolutionary Guards. By this point, Manoocher had grown a bushy beard to stick out less, assimilating his appearance to that of a Revolutionary Guard. The man behind the counter turned pale. Excuse me, yes, of course. I will arrange for the plane to wait for you, no problem. Please proceed to gate 2. I wish you a pleasant flight, he grovelled zealously. It was afternoon when Manoocher arrived to the pious desert town. From the plane he could recognize the flat mud brick houses and the enormous shrine that attracted flocks of pilgrims every year. Despite it just being April, the air was already hot and sticky. Yet it was still almost another 500 kilometers to Tabas, deeper into the heart of the country, mainly via dust roads. Who on earth would still go out there tonight? First he went to the military airbase to find out what they knew about the UFO crash. Not much, they replied, and no, they were not intending to drive out there tonight. It would be dark soon. Maybe tomorrow. They'll see. Tomorrow was not an option for Manoocher. He glanced down at his press card and thought, what worked once will work twice. And thus he stepped into the lion's den, the local Pastaran headquarters, the base of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. Even here, after Manoocher briefly flashed his ID and asked to be taken to the commander, the guard on duty led the photographer right into the command center, which was furnished with a large central table with a map of Iran, around which several men in uniforms were standing and discussing something. The commander himself was talking on the phone. Yes, Agha. Of course. We did that. Yes, we will. Certainly, Mr. President. Apparently he was talking directly to the President of Iran, Abdul Hassan Bani Sadr. Finally, he put down the receiver and looked at the men. Brothers, he said, I have received a direct order. We have to leave right now. Then he saw Manoocher. And you, brother, who are you? The address swiftly assessed the situation. They must have been talking about this UFO. I specifically came from Tehran after what happened in Tabas, he said. Excellent, excellent. We depart immediately. And so they did, in 2 trucks and a jeep which arduously struggled along the bumpy, unpaved road. It was pitch dark, and the journey took the whole night. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness and illuminated the path that lay ahead of them. In the beams of light, only the occasional moth or an escaping animal could be seen. It was dawn when they finally saw the outline of the small town of Tabas, far as the desert's horizon, drenched in the orange light of the sun's first rays. But they took a turn before reaching it, and were now driving directly on the parched land until, just up ahead, they could make out 2 helicopters and some wrecks. The little motorcade stopped, and all the passengers got out. Immediately, Manoocher forgot his fatigue and his aching rear. What on earth had happened here? He saw several attack helicopters, one of them with its rotor blades still turning. The wrecks, of a plane and a helicopter each, were entirely gutted. They were definitely not flying saucers, but instead US troop carriers. The Pastaran didn't seem surprised at all. They must have known all along what was waiting for them out here. So the Americans had indeed tried to carry out a military operation in Iran, supposedly to free the hostages, and obviously something had gone terribly wrong. Apart from the new arrivals, no living soul was to be seen, only several corpses. The identity tags around their necks confirmed the assumption that they were US soldiers. Their bodies were burned and dreadfully disfigured by fire. The charred muscles and tendons had bent their limbs into bizarre positions. Their burned lips had retracted and gave the dead the impression of a tormented grin. The stench was infernal. The militias immediately started to search the helicopters for useful material. Apparently they found what they were looking for, because they started to load transport boxes and other objects into the truck. Manoocher walked around and photographed the site of the crash. Charred remains and parts of the exploded machines and their freight lay all around his feet. What was that, glittering in the sand? He bent down to pick it up. It was the battered remains of a beer can from a German brewery, the red and white logo still well recognizable. And there, another one. They must have been on board the US troop carrier. Did the Americans permit such a thing? A crescendoing humming announced the arrival of another helicopter, first only visible as a dot in the sky, then approaching quickly and finally landing nearby. A young man jumped out, introducing himself as the government's official photographer. "I have been sent to photograph the site of the crash," he said. "The images will be needed as quickly as possible in Tehran. The president's office just sent me." The commander looked at Manoocher inquisitively. Manoocher was sweating, but answered confidently, "I am authorized by the Ministry for Islamic Guidance." That satisfied the commander, and he turned his attention to other matters. Why shouldn't 2 government organizations send their own respective photographers? And Manoocher hadn't even lied. With his press card, he was authorized by the ministry. The other photographer took some pictures, and just 5 minutes later was in his helicopter again, on his way back to the capital. Manoocher had toyed with the idea of asking him for a lift, but had swiftly scrapped it. He didn't want to provoke any unnecessary questions. As it turned out, he did well to remain on site, because only half an hour later the next visitor arrived, this time in a motorcade of trucks. It was Ayatollah Khalkhali himself, the hangman of the revolution, along with a group of bodyguards and militiamen. Not that Manoocher was eager to meet the man who boasted of having personally sentenced 10,000 people to their deaths during drumhead trials, but it was a unique opportunity to photograph him while he was inspecting the wrecks, the remaining chopper, and not least the corpses. Khalkhali seemed particularly interested in the dead bodies. He likely envisioned humiliating their arch-nemesis, the USA, by publicly parading the mortal remains of their soldiers around the city. Therefore, he ordered his escorts to pack the 8 bodies into body bags and to heave them into the trucks. His henchmen, who most likely had not gotten their jobs as the Chief Justice's bodyguards because of their squeamishness, refused to touch the grisly corpses. At this point, Khalkhali threw one of his infamous fits. His veins bobbed, and with a crimson-red face he started to shout, "Damn it! Are you all little lambs without balls? What are you actually good for? Why am I only surrounded by idiots? Look here, for crying out loud, this is how it's done." The short round man in the mullah's robe roughly tugged one of the corpses from the debris and dragged it onto one of the black plastic tarpaulins. Pieces of charred tissue dribbled onto the sand. It wasn't a nice view. But the militiamen were more afraid of Ayatollah Khalkhali than nauseated by death, and so they quickly set to work. Within an hour, all the bodies, as well as any material deemed useful, was loaded onto the trucks, and it was time to go. The Pastaran from Mashhad, with whom Manoocher had driven out here, had used the arrival of Khalkhali and his men as an excuse to leave the field, and thus the responsibility for dealing with the situation, to them, and had made off. meaning that leaving with one of the most blood-stained leaders of the revolution and his escort was Manoucher's only opinion if he didn't want to be left alone in the desert. They assigned him a seat inside the truck with the corpses, which is why, after several hours' drive, he got off in the next town to look for a civilian means of transportation back to Tehran. Upon arriving back to the capital, he went straight to the airport, found the next flight departing for Paris, and picked out a French passenger who was taking the flight. He gave the film rolls from Tabas to him to pass them on to the photo agency SIPA in Paris. That is how the photos of the crash site, the wrecks, and of Ayatollah Khalkhali inspecting the corpses of the killed American soldiers made their way to the public and were published internationally. Later on, the world would learn the details of the failed rescue attempt by the US military. The operation, codenamed Eagle Claw, was supposed to free the hostages from the US Embassy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tehran, taking them out of the country. During a sandstorm, one of the helicopters collided with a troop carrier and both went up in flames. The bodies of the 8 soldiers killed in the blast were left behind. So were several helicopters with their cargo and documents, which represented precious technical and intelligence information for Iran. Of course, the mullahs asserted that God had had a hand in all this. That wasn't Manoucher's last encounter with Ayatollah Khalkhali. In the weeks that followed, the latter concentrated on his anti-drug campaign in the Iranian capital, which meant that he had hundreds of drug addicts and dealers arrested, and more often than not, executed. One day, Manoucher noticed him during a rally on the street, squeezed through the crowd, past the bodyguards who nodded at him in recognition, and directly addressed the Ayatollah. "I'd like to produce a story about you and your work. Can I come take some photos of you at work one of these days? Come to the Gaza prison tomorrow. I have an office there." And with these scarce words, he turned away and left. The next morning, Manoucher drove out to the jail in question. Its name meant Palace Prison, and it was an imposing white building with high, narrow windows that was attached to the original historical brick palace. The jail had already served as a place to lock away political prisoners under the Shah. Manoucher knew the building well. His brother Reza had spent 2 years here because of his political activities. He climbed the stairs up to the main entrance, showed the guard his press card, and was instantly let in. The guard let him into the vast inner courtyard, where he again met Khalkhali's bodyguards, standing around with their legs apart. There were no prisoners around them. They must all be in their cells. Or, a terrible thought occurred to him, they had all been executed. "Good morning," he greeted the bodyguards. "Good morning, brother. What are you looking for here?" One of the guards, the broadest and oldest of them, apparently their leader, replied. The others nodded in silence. "I would like to see Ayatollah Khalkhali. He asked me to meet him here." "I would not recommend that." "Why?" Manoucher asked in surprise. "He's foaming with rage again. Better to wait here for a while." "Okay, thanks for the tip." That very moment, loud yelling erupted from behind the door in front of which they were standing, and behind which Manoucher suspected was the Ayatollah's office. Apparently he was really letting someone have it. What exactly he was yelling about was unfortunately incomprehensible, but it seemed to be related to money. The bodyguards stoically looked straight ahead and appeared unaffected by the clamor. Probably they were used to it. When the shouting subsided, Manoucher waited another couple of minutes and then looked questioningly at the chief bodyguard. The latter nodded approvingly and gestured with his hand at the office door. Manoucher knocked, heard a kind of humming from the room, which he interpreted as an approval, opened the door and entered cautiously. Khalkhali sat behind his desk, on which bags full of banknotes, gold, and jewellery were piled up. In front of the desk sat a poor and scruffy-looking young man, obviously the one who had just been lambasted. Before Manoucher could utter a greeting, the Ayatollah snapped at him. "Who let you in?" I'm the reporter, remember? You told me I should come here for my reportage." But the Ayatollah wasn't interested in a reply. He immediately leapt up and was now running towards the photographer, who was so startled that he started running too, out of the office and back into the prison courtyard. Khalkhali ran after him. He was a short, chubby man and should not have been able to run that fast, but what he lacked in fitness he made up for in fury. There was nowhere to hide in the courtyard, so the two of them ended up chasing each other around the water well in the center of the courtyard, almost as if they were in a cartoon, until one of the bodyguards interfered and stopped Khalkhali. "But that's only the reporter," he said, confused. "Why didn't anybody tell me?" Khalkhali snarled at his subordinate. "But I did," Manoucher tried to explain, but the bodyguard silenced him with a warning glance. The Ayatollah returned with swift steps to his office and banged the door shut. "I warned you," the head bodyguard commented with a broad, almost gleeful smile. Some of the others could hardly suppress their laughter. Others just shrugged. None of them seemed particularly surprised by their boss's behavior. Nevertheless, they brought Manoocher tea and water, perhaps as an apology for the Ayatollah's bizarre behavior. After a while, his office door flew open, and his voice boomed. "Bring the French reporter!" French reporter. Apparently Khalkhali knew very well where Manoocher was sending his pictures. Manoocher gulped and re-entered the office. The bags had been removed from the desk and were now tucked into a dark corner of the room. The other man who had been inside earlier was nowhere to be seen. "What do you want?" Khalkhali asked. "If you recall, it was you who told me to come here so that I could take photos of you. I'd like to tell the world about your efforts to ensure law and order." "Then come back tomorrow." Manoocher nodded and left the office. No, not only the office, but the whole prison building, as fast as he could. Upon reaching the exit, he started to run until he reached the next street corner. He never, ever returned to that place again. 11. Censored. If the people of this religion are asked about the proof for the soundness of their religion, they flare up, get angry, and spill the blood of whoever confronts them with this question. They forbid rational speculation and strive to kill their adversaries. This is why truth became thoroughly silenced and concealed. Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi. Iran and Lebanon, 1980. The photos that had made it into the international press during the last month didn't please the censorship bureau at all. It was especially important to them that the public executions be hidden from the world. Only the Iranian people were meant to see them. Manoocher was still allowed to work, but he had to submit to strict censorship. The procedure was more or less as follows. He brought some of his developed films, the officially harmless ones, that is, of course, of parades and public rallies by supporters of the regime, to the censorship office, where a grim-looking officer, who had, by the way, studied in the United States, in a small and drab office of the Ministry of Islamic Guidance. The officer carefully examined the pictures with his magnifying glasses, which he slowly moved over the prints with his left hand, while holding a burning cigarette in his right, scrutinizing them one by one very slowly. The smoke from his cigarette formed swirls above the film strips inside the small, windowless room. Occasionally he asked questions. "Did you attend this rally, brother?" "Yes, of course." "And why didn't you take pictures of the parade of our glorious fighters instead of these people here?" He pointed to some of the photos with his burning cigarette. "I thought the spectators were important too. I like to document the things others don't." The censorship officer grumbled something. As there was, to his apparent displeasure, nothing to complain about, he sealed the films with a piece of tape that he stamped with the official seal of his censorship bureau. Then he returned them to Manoocher, who was now permitted to pass them on to a news agency or a magazine, or, in his case, a random passenger going to France. Getting caught with unsealed, smuggled images could be dangerous for all parties involved. Back at home, he removed the tape from the official approved photos with steam and carefully wrapped it around the images he really wanted to see published. Photos from public flagellations and executions, from protests against Ayatollah Khomeini, or simply of the economic hardship in the country. Then he drove to the airport and chose a suitable candidate from among the waiting passengers. Nobody ever refused, and the photos always reached their destination. Not once did a single photo get lost. Though he had avoided getting into trouble with the authorities, Manoocher thought it might be wise to leave the country for a few weeks to avoid drawing further attention to himself. He had somehow gotten in touch with the sister of the Lebanese Imam Musa as-Sadr, the founder of the Shia Amal movement in Lebanon, who had gone missing without a trace in Libya. She had asked Manoocher to travel to Lebanon in order to photograph her brother's work, the training camps of the incipient Amal militia, the predecessor of the Hezbollah, who were trained by Pasdaran militiamen from Iran. An offer that the reporter couldn't refuse. He took a plane from Tehran to Beirut, where he was greeted at the airport like an official representative of the Islamic Republic. What the heck had as-Sadr's sister told the Lebanese? In any case, he was treated extremely well, a welcome change from the harassment reporters were normally subjected to in Tehran. They arranged for him to stay in a nice hotel in central Beirut. After an excellent dinner, he was looking forward to a pleasant night in a soft bed, but his sleep was interrupted by a loud bang in the early morning hours. He quickly sprang out of the bed and ran to the window that looked out onto the street. There was now a long crack running across the pane. Manoocher could see black fumes billowing from the first floor of the building across the street. Just then, part of the building's facade collapsed into the street with a deafening boom, covering the street in a dense cloud of dust and smoke. The building that now bore a gaping hole was the Lebanon office of the Iranian radio and TV station. Apparently that's what had just been blown up, although at least it had happened at a time of night when fewer people than normal would have been inside the building. Now, with the ringing in his ears ceasing, Manoocher could hear startled cries from the streets and from the hotel corridor. He grabbed his camera and went down to the reception, which had suffered some damage as well. Dust-covered but seemingly unhurt people were gathered in the lobby. He continued on, crossed the street, and scanned the entry hall of the damaged building. 2 injured people were receiving first aid treatment. Some men were already busy carrying piles of documents out of the destroyed offices. The destruction centered around the elevator shaft. The bomb had been placed inside the elevator and sent from one of the upper, almost undamaged stories down to the first floor, where it had exploded. Manoocher Deghati? He turned around. It was one of the Amal delegates who had, along with some government representatives, picked him up from the airport the previous day. He seemed worried. Yes? We should leave. We don't know who's responsible for this. We do know, however, that the Iranians were targeted. Who knows? Maybe there's a second bombing planned. We'd better leave Beirut a bit earlier than planned. 3 Amal members and a driver accompanied him in a car into the Bekaa Valley in southern Lebanon, where they visited training camps for future militiamen, 15-year-old or so teenagers who were being trained by Iranian and Syrian officers. Manoocher took photos ceaselessly. The camps looked like the summer camps of scouts, save that here they were learning about war and killing. The boys listened to and obeyed their instructors enthusiastically. It was all still a game for them. They would get a first taste of war's true face on one of those days when Ammar organized a propaganda parade through a predominantly Christian neighborhood, which resulted in an attack by a Lebanese Christian citizens' militia. Both sides suffered casualties. The small delegation slept somewhere different each night, usually in private homes. They always arrived late, under the curtain of night, and their hosts served them excellent food. There were always starters, braised meat, crispy bread, piquant cheese, and fresh fruit. Tell me, one of his attendants asked on the second day, who or what are you really? I mean, you come from the Islamic Republic, don't you? Yes. Why? I've been watching you. You don't pray at the prescribed hours. Damn. Busted. But Shiites will always find an excuse. Well, I need to work. I have a mission, after all, so I don't always manage to pray at the prescribed rooms, but I always make up for the prayers at night in my hotel room. The man narrowed his eyes in suspicion, but then shrugged and seemed to accept the response. In one of the Hezbollah training camps, a big, muscular, dark-skinned trainer who spoke broken Arabic with a strong American accent attracted Manoocher's attention. He addressed the man in English. Hi, you're not from here either. I'm American. What about you? I'm from Iran. My name is Manoocher. Mine's Musa. Pleased to meet you. So am I. Musa isn't a typical American name, though, is it? I chose it myself when I converted to Islam. You're Muslim? Yeah. Shia? Yeah, man. And how did you end up training fighters here in Lebanon? I came with the Marines first, but then I found Allah and stayed in the region. I got a mission to fulfill here. Which is? Man, I'm here to fight for Allah and become a martyr. 2 years later, Manoocher would find out that Musa had been arrested and executed in Iran for allegedly being an American spy. Whether or not he'd really been a spy, he had indeed become a martyr, although probably not in the way he had imagined. When he returned to Beirut, Manoocher brought his film rolls to the office of French press agency AFP. The photos of the Hezbollah training camps were published worldwide and caused him quite a few problems. Because of this, much now had become clear. This man was no friend of violence or armed militias. The Ministry for Islamic Guidance would have to keep an even closer eye on him. 12. War. Ignore those that make you fearful and sad, that degrade you back towards disease and death. Rumi. Iran, 1980. On September 22nd, 1980, around noon, a number of loud explosions could be heard in Tehran. Nobody in the neighborhood knew where they came from. Manoocher called his journalist colleagues at the AFP office and asked them, "Hey, any idea what's going on? The explosions, I mean. They say the airport's been bombed." "Bombed? By whom?" "Don't know. We're trying to figure out the same thing." He got into his car and crossed the city as fast as possible to reach the airport. Already from afar he could see the thick black smoke rising from the airport into the sky. The air stank of burnt rubber. Just before the airport, soldiers had erected a roadblock. Manoocher slowly pulled over and made a questioning gesture. One of the soldiers approached his car. "You can't proceed. The airport's closed," he said. He appeared nervous and was fiddling about with his gun. "What happened?" "The Iraqis attacked. They bombarded the airport and other targets around the whole country. They're preparing to invade." "My God!" Manoocher took a few photos of the smoke and the soldiers, then turned the car around and raced quickly back to the city, straight to his friend and colleague Kaveh Golistan, who he found in his office. "A war's started. The Iraqis are invading," he rushed to tell him. "Good gracious! From where? Do you know?" Kaveh absent-mindedly stroked his big black walrus mustache. "From the southern border, from Khuzestan. They'd hardly come over the mountains, would they?" "You want to go?" "As soon as possible." "Oh, count me in." They hired a car with a driver and left. The three of them drove the entire afternoon, the evening, and the whole night over pitch-dark country roads, taking turns driving and making only brief stops to refuel or drink a quick cup of tea. From Tehran it is no less than 1,000 kilometers to Khuzestan. On the last 200-kilometer stretch, they were the only ones going south. All the other vehicles were coming towards them. Some of the drivers waved frenetically and even stopped them. "Are you crazy? Go back! There's war down there! The Iraqis are coming!" After a while they could see a thin trail of smoke curling up into the sky from one of the villages on the horizon. "Is something burning over there?" "No, I think they're just baking bread this time of the day," the driver said. Upon closer examination, they realized that the smoke was not bread baking at all. The Iraqi planes had bombarded the village and set one of the houses on fire. That was just a taste of what they would encounter when they approached the city of Abadan. Already from afar, the light had turned a strange and unreal hue. The sky was glowing in a surreal orange-red tone, crossed by heavy black billows of smoke. The air was filled with a pungent stench of burning and the powerful smell of gunpowder. The biggest oil refinery in the world had once stood here in Abadan. Now it was blazing fiercely. Inside the city itself, houses were ablaze too, set on fire by the bombardment. A thick and smeary film of soot was slowly settling over the city. It was total chaos. Nobody had been prepared to handle such a situation. The army in the provinces only existed on paper after the new rulers had executed all the influential generals. A few people with handguns had volunteered to defend the city and were now trying to maintain at least a semblance of order in Abadan. The hospital was filled with wounded people. Kaveh and Manoocher stayed in the city the whole day and night to take pictures, and the bombardment went on the whole night. The Iraqi troops did not advance further. They had by no means intended to occupy the whole of Iran, only the oil-rich Khuzestan, officially to destabilize its neighbor. The country-wide airstrikes on airports were meant to disable the Iranian Air Force, but had only destroyed or damaged a small part of the country's military planes. Now the Iranian army was rebuilt in no time. The vacant generals' positions were filled with men from the ranks of paramilitary troops loyal to the regime. A long war was looming. Back in Tehran, Manoocher called the press agency SIPA in Paris to discuss how to continue sending photos to them. Its founder, Gökçin Sipahioglu, categorically excluded the possibility of mailing the film rolls. "We have to find a way to deliver the films directly by messenger," he insisted. "But the airports are closed, all flights cancelled." "Then you'll have to hand the films over to a messenger at the Turkish border. They've closed the border crossings as well. But I agree, it's the only possibility. We'll have to figure it out." Having only just returned to the capital from the southern province, Manoocher now had to travel to the northern border. Sipa had sent photographer Koshkun Aral to the border from the Turkish side. Manoocher came, after having driven the whole night, from the south to the same, now closed border crossing. He tried the same old trick, confident demeanor and a military-looking press card. He stepped in front of the two guards on duty, flashed his ID as quickly as possible, and asked briskly, "Tehran has sent me to control the borders. Is everything all right here?" The border guards saluted. "Yes, sir," they answered. He let his eyes scan the borderline, surveyed the buildings, narrowed his eyes to the slits as if he had something to complain about, then walked casually towards the high, steel-wire armored fence, close to the now closed gate that was supposed to allow crossing the border to Turkey. Over the other side of the fence he recognized Koshkun Aral. The two men gave each other a signal. Manoocher turned towards the border guards. "I would like to greet my Turkish colleague here," he said. Used to unquestioning obedience, the two men in uniform saluted and continued to patrol up and down the fence. Manoocher passed the film rolls to Koshkun through the fence as quickly as possible before the guards could become suspicious. "Everything okay on your side, Koshkun?" His colleague grinned. "It's not me who's having trouble. I just explained what I was doing here to the people in charge of it on my side. They had no objections." Manoocher passed the last film across the fence. "So long, then," he said. "Make sure the films get to Paris safely." "And you take care," said Koshkun. "I'll try." Koshkun brought the films by plane to Paris, and from there they made it to the New York Times, Life, and Newsweek via the Concorde to New York. That's how the first photos of the Iran-Iraq War, from the burning oil refinery and from the destructions in Abadan, found their way to the US press. 13. Battles. Older men declare war, but it is the youth that must fight and die. Herbert Hoover. Iran, 1980–1985. The outbreak of war was the best thing that could have happened to Iran's new rulers, binding together the nation and turning its attention to an external enemy instead of the internal oppression. The masses were quickly mobilized. The youth was stripped up by permanent propaganda and committed to the war. A strong Iranian nationalism and the accompanying contempt for all things Arab made it all the easier for the regime. Children, boys and girls separately, of course, were familiarized with weapons from a very early age, and now paraded the streets of the Iranian cities in uniform or in chador, respectively, chanting and shouting slogans. Who would have dared to oppose the war? "There is no reason to end the war. Iraq has to be occupied, otherwise our revolution is doomed to fail," Khomeini announced. His right hand and later successor, Ali Khamenei, added, "I, Speaker of the nation, who has the people's trust, I tell you, the war will be continued until the last drop of blood." And thus, slowly but surely, all young men were drafted. For journalists and photographers, the situation was getting more complicated. To be able to report from the front, they had to participate in official guided tours organized by the military for the press with a lot of staging. To independently take at least a few photos from the war zone, a journalist had to guarantee they wouldn't send any pictures abroad. But Manoocher wanted to show war's true face and photograph the battlefields before they were tidied up for the official propaganda images. For months he negotiated with a responsible institution, the Committee for War Propaganda, to obtain a permit to join the troops at the front as an embedded reporter. In return, he promised the Committee for War Propaganda photos for their own publications. Head of that committee was Kamal Kharazi, a man who would later become ambassador to the United Nations and Minister of Foreign Affairs. He hated independent journalists and tried to make their work as difficult as possible. Therefore, Manoocher went directly to the Minister for Islamic Guidance and later to President Mohammad Khatami, also promising to send him photos for his publications. He was finally granted the special permit. In the end, Manoocher, along with his colleagues Kaveh Golestan and Alfred Yarobzadeh, were allowed to join the troops at the front line, although they were constantly observed by two watchdogs who kept an eye on their every move. Accompanied by their chaperones, they flew to the provincial capital Ahvaz in a military plane. There were rumors that an offensive by Iranian forces to free the city of Khorramshahr from Iraqi troops was to start the next morning at dawn. Nobody knew any more details. The three of them sat in their room in a hotel late in the evening. It must have been almost midnight, packing their camera bags for the next day. With a loud bang, the door suddenly slammed open, and 3 armed men, wearing the somehow always slightly grubby-looking uniforms of the Revolutionary Guards, walked into the room. "Show us your permit," one of them demanded harshly, without any greeting. The men looked at each other in astonishment. "We got it from the Minister for Islamic Guidance himself. And who are you to barge in like this?" The Revolutionary Guard who had spoken snorted, lifted his weapon, and indicated at it with a condescending nod of his head. "This tells you all you need to know about who we are. Listen, we're officially here from the Ministry, and you have no rights." The 3 guards lifted their guns in unison, and each pointed them at one of the reporters. Okay, all right. The permit's over there, in the folder on the table." One of the hitmen walked over to the table and pocketed the entire folder, which contained their accreditation and all copies. Then they lowered their weapons and left the room. "There we go," one of them added as he banged the door shut. The 3 reporters looked at each other. "Now what?" "We have to report what just happened. I mean, the Pasdaran have no right to just seize a ministerial permission, do they? The ministry has a representative staying here at the hotel. Let's go right now." They went to find the room that served as a local office for the ministry. Since it was the night before the planned major offensive, they would surely still be up and about. They knocked the door, were let in, and reported to the representative, a tall man in white shirt with a grey beard, what had happened. He listened attentively to their story, nodded a few times, then called a number in Tehran, repeating what had happened in a short version and asking for instructions. Again he nodded repeatedly. "Well," he said, after having replaced the receiver, "there's no problem. You just come along as you are. You don't need your permit." "Listen," one of the 3, maybe Alfred, said, "we can't do that. If the Pasdaran finds us at the front line without a permit, they'll gun us down." "I guess that's why they took our permit, because that's what they're hoping to do," Calvet added. "We need your new letter from the minister." Again a nod, another call, and the promise that Tehran would fax a new permit to the hotel in the morning. With this solution, the ministry's representative dismissed them to retreat to their own rooms. "Where were our babysitters when we needed them?" asked Manoocher. "I guess they're in cahoots with the Revolutionary Guards. I hope not. They're bad enough the way they are." The following morning, the fax from the ministry indeed arrived at the hotel. It was brought up to the reporter's room immediately, but by then the military offensive had long begun. It had started at 4 a.m. So they arrived at the front line in Khorramshahr a few hours late, once the battle was already well underway. It raged for almost 2 days, despite almost 20,000 Iraqi soldiers having surrendered immediately. Another 10,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed, while on the Iranian side the number of the dead was 30,000. Iranian troops captured the same number of Iraqi prisoners of war. In short, it was a gigantic instance of attrition warfare, in which 40,000 people died as cannon fodder and countless men were wounded. The seriously injured lay on the stretchers near the river, waiting to be taken away. Whoever was still conscious held his own infusion bag. School and public buses had been turned into makeshift ambulances. They were filled with teenagers whose hands had been blasted away, men with burned faces, bodies drenched in blood. Manoocher took photos of bulldozers used by members of the Revolutionary Guards to push heaps of corpses into mass graves, and crying men who had been assigned to take all useful weapons, helmets, and boots from the bodies of dead soldiers and to arrange them into piles. The worst thing, though, Manoocher found, were the child soldiers. Their brains washed out by religious propaganda, they gladly went into battle, worked as minesweepers, and died like flies. "Come, brother! Come with us to become a martyr!" they called out to him. He replied, "I prefer to be a living photographer than a martyr." Of course, his work was also dangerous. He was always at risk of being hit by a shrapnel or a stray bullet. The fanatical troops of the Pasdaran and Basijis represented a considerable risk, too. To receive quick treatment in case of an injury, he had written his blood group on his hand. Fortunately, nothing happened to him, not least because, as he found out later, he had his blood group wrong. The chaperones, who were suddenly around again, painstakingly watched what he photographed and dictated a maximum number of films he was allowed to use, always trying to make sure that he didn't hide any films. Sometimes they destroyed films or negatives, and many photos vanished without a trace. Nevertheless, Manoocher always somehow managed to hide a few spare films, to save a major part of his work, and even to distribute it. A French journalist who was just leaving Iran took his photos abroad. One of the things the authorities could hardly prohibit was visiting cemeteries and taking pictures there. Hundreds of burials of war victims took place here every day, mostly of fallen soldiers, young men, teenagers, sometimes children whose mothers, sisters, and aunts wept in desperation. Whole fields of tombs of young men were planted, the portraits of the deceased stuck onto sticks on top of the freshly heaped burial mounds. A fountain was erected at the Behesht-e-Zahra cemetery in Tehran to honor the fallen, its water dyed blood red. Rumor spread that the crimson water brought luck and honored the dead, so many people drank from it. Unfortunately, many of them died because the red dye was poisonous. Tehran had 2 hotels in which foreign journalists could stay. The former Intercontinental Hotel, now after the revolution known as the Laleh, was shaped like a huge oblong box and was reserved for the well-heeled journalists working for the most important media channels and magazines. Everybody else stayed at the Park Hotel. That's where Manoocher, too, stopped by once in a while to meet colleagues and have a cup of tea with them. One morning, a couple in the breakfast room attracted his attention. The man looked somewhat Italian, the woman, by contrast, very Nordic, with light blonde hair that she did not have to cover inside the hotel. When walking by them, he realized that they indeed spoke Italian. That's why he approached them. "Buongiorno," he said. The 2 of them looked up in surprise. "Buongiorno," they replied. "My name is Manoocher," he introduced himself. "I'm a photojournalist. I heard you talking in Italian. I actually studied in Rome." "Pleased to meet you," the man replied. "I am Adriano, and this is my companion, Randi. She's a photographer, too. Would you like to join us?" "With pleasure." He sat down and shook their hands. "But you aren't Italian, are you?" he asked Randi. "We live in Italy, but no, I'm originally from Norway." "And you, Adriano?" "Sofri. Adriano Sofri." "No. Seriously?" "Seriously. You know my name?" "I always read your articles when I lived in Rome, sir." "Please drop the sir. In the end, we're all in the same boat. The 2 of us are here to report about the situation in Iran for the Lotta Continua." Manoocher sighed. "Not easy, is it?" Randi gave a little laugh. "Indeed. Listen, do you happen to know a photo lab where I can develop my films?" "I have one at home where I develop my own films that you're free to use." And so they saw each other regularly. "I'm fed up with all the political speeches and propaganda here," Adriano said one day. "Let's get out of the city and visit the rest of the country to see how things are going in the provinces." In those days, the government was starting to rant about the country's cultural heritage, especially the pre-Islamic one, which they deemed blasphemous, going so far to encourage the destruction of sites like Pasargadae and Persepolis. "I want to see them before it might be too late," Adriano added. "Are you coming with us?" "Count me in. What do you need? A car? Maybe a driver?" "We don't have any money," Randi's voice chimed in from the dark room. "We're traveling on a minimal budget," Adriano affirmed. "Well, then we'll go hitchhiking. No problem." They roamed half the country, usually riding in trucks, and visited Isfahan, Shiraz, Pasargadae, and Persepolis. Everywhere they went, courageous individuals were busy saving the local cultural heritage from seizure by religious fanatics. The Chehel Sotun Palace in Isfahan, a man had walled up all the frescoes depicting women to prevent them from being knocked off the wall. In Persepolis, they met the man who had thrown himself in front of the bulldozer sent by Ayatollah Khalkhali to level the ruins. He had actually succeeded in discouraging them from their intentions. The director of the Museum for Modern Art in Tehran locked the works of artists such as Marc Chagall, Salvador Dalí, and Pablo Picasso into the museum's underground vaults, where they remain disregarded to this day. Amidst all these events, journeys, tragedies, the danger, the scarceness of resources, and the regular harassment, Manoocher got married and became a father for the first time. At night, when the missiles fell on Tehran and one could never be sure where they would land until one could hear the impact more or less in the distance, he went to the garden with his young daughter Maral, clapping at the lights falling from the sky, saying that it just was fireworks, so the child would not be scared. 14. Escape. Better it is to flee from ruin and to escape than to be taken. Homer. From Tehran to Paris, 1985. He had just arrived home when the phone rang. War had been raging for 5 years now, and there was still no end in sight, neither of war nor of the mullah's dictatorship. It was hot. Manoocher wiped his face with a towel and commiserated with a woman who had to leave the house covered from head to toe in a dark cloak in this weather. A lot had happened in the last few years. Last year, for example, an Air France plane had been hijacked in Switzerland and diverted to Tehran, where the hijackers finally released all hostages and blew up the airplane's cockpit with explosives. Manoocher had been there. And also, last year, he had won first prize at World Press Photo for his coverage of the Iran-Iraq War. The phone was still ringing. He sighed tiredly and picked up the phone. Yes, Manoocher Deghati. Speaking. Who's calling? Mustafa. Remember me? Your neighbor from school years. Oh, Mustafa. Yes, sure. What are you doing these days? This isn't a courtesy call, Manoocher. Listen, some important people, and that means us, don't like what you're doing. Your photos endanger the revolution and everything we have accomplished so far. You are an enemy of Allah and of the people. Do you understand? But Listen, I said. They will find you. I mean, we will find you. We will finish you off. Do you understand? I do. Mustafa hung up. Manoocher slowly replaced the receiver. He wasn't threatening me. He wanted to warn me, maybe because I would always help him with his homework, he thought. He probably doesn't dare to openly warn me out of fear of being tapped. That's why he kept asking, do you understand? He hasted through the apartment, calling for his wife. Where are you? I'm here in the bedroom. We have to leave right now. They're coming to get me. Pack a few things for Maral and you. We'll be away for at least a few weeks. In half an hour we leave for the airport. Fortunately, due to his work for AFP, he had a French visa for the whole family. Now all they needed was to find a flight. As precaution, just in case of an arrest, they took separate taxis. His wife and young daughter with most of their luggage left in one taxi, and then some minutes later he got himself a second one, carrying only one small piece of luggage. The ride to the airport was nerve-wracking. It was still hot, the taxi went from one traffic jam to the next, and sometimes he had the impression that he was being followed by another car. Hadn't that black limousine been behind them for quite a long time? And hadn't he seen that battered jeep over there with the 4 bearded men inside before? But maybe they were just going to the airport as well. The little family arrived safely in Paris with only 2 suitcases. It rapidly became clear that they would be there for more than just a few weeks. From Tehran they heard news about a wave of arrests and executions. Mustafa had done well to warn Manoocher. Despite working for the French, and despite his brother Reza already having fled there 4 years ago, it was difficult to settle in Paris. With their Iranian passports, which were not especially well received, they had to stand in lines for hours to get their residency and work permits, despite a letter of recommendation from Manoocher's employer. In addition, the mentality of the French was, to put it mildly, not always easy to understand. They stayed in Paris for 1 year, after which Manoocher got an offer to go to Central America for AFP to establish the agency's photo department in the region, an opportunity he couldn't miss.